The evening sun sinks low over the vast rolling plains of the Pannonian Basin, casting long amber shadows across a landscape transitioning into winter. The endless seas of high summer grass have given way to silent golden fields of stubble, touched at the edges by the first silver needles of frost. A quiet stillness settles over the land, broken only by the soft rhythmic sigh of the north wind blowing down from the distant dark crests of the Carpathian Mountains. The great Danube River flows wide and heavy, its deep slate-grey waters moving with a slow, deliberate grace, mirroring the gradual darkening of the medieval sky. Along its banks, the ancient oaks and willows stand like silent sentinels, shedding their final amber leaves into the cool current. In the small, scattered settlements that dot the plains, the daily rhythms of life begin to slow. The heavy wooden carts have been brought back to the courtyards, their iron-rimmed wheels resting on the damp, cooling earth. Smoke rises straight and true from the thatch-roofed cottages, thin ribbons of pale blue and grey drifting lazily into the twilight air, carrying with them the rich, comforting scent of burning oak and dried peat. Within these humble dwellings, the air is thick with the aroma of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and the simple earthy smell of grain stored in heavy earthenware jars. The families gather near the central hearths, where the low orange glow of the embers flickers softly against the rough-hewn timber walls and clay floors. Yet, as the darkness deepens, a palpable chill creeps through the gaps in the wooden shutters and beneath the heavy doors. The clothing of the people, woven from coarse, rudimentary fibres, offers little defence against the damp, biting air that characterises the early 10th century winters in this young kingdom. The fabric is rough to the touch, stiff and unyielding, lacking the dense weave needed to trap the heat of the fire. The children huddle closer to the flames, their small hands tucked into the folds of scratchy blankets, while the elders look out at the gathering stars, knowing that the coming months will bring a long, bitter cold. The tools for transforming raw earth into protective warmth are still simple, and the knowledge of the advanced arts of the needle and the frame remains distant, locked away in the great cultural centres of the West. High upon the rocky promontory of Veszprém, the stones of the early royal court catch the last faint glimmer of daylight. The thick, pale limestone walls reflect the dimming sky, standing as a quiet monument of order in a vast, untamed territory. Inside the long halls, the atmosphere is calm and solemn. Tall beeswax candles burn with a steady, golden flame, casting soft light upon the stone floors and the heavy wool tapestries brought from distant lands. Here, the air smells of melted wax, clean linen, and the faint, sweet scent of dried lavender scattered across the floorboards. It is a place of quiet contemplation, suspended between the old ways of the open plains and the new dawn of a structured, settled world. Through the tall, narrow windows of the palace, the view stretches across the darkening valleys, where the small lights of distant hearths flicker like fallen stars. The world outside is growing cold, wrapping itself in a mantle of silence and ice. But within these stone walls, a new warmth is beginning to take shape, guided not by the iron of swords, but by the quiet, disciplined motion of a mind trained in the ancient, restorative traditions of craftsmanship and care. The long winter is approaching, but with it comes the silent promise of a transformation that will begin with a single thread, stretched tight under the watchful eye of a queen. Long before she ever looked out over the wide Hungarian plains, Princess Gisela spent her formative years within the peaceful, orderly sanctuaries of Bavaria. Born into the illustrious house of the Ottonians, her early world was one of quiet cloisters, high-arched stone scriptoriums, and manicured gardens where the scent of rosemary and damp boxwood filled the morning air. In the great monastic centres of Regensburg, the days were measured not by the chaotic clash of arms, but by the steady ringing of bronze bells and the soft, scratching sound of goose quills moving across fine vellum parchment. Here, under the watchful eyes of scholarly tutors and devout artisans, the young princess absorbed a philosophy of governance that valued structure, beauty, and the preservation of practical wisdom. The atmosphere of her childhood was deeply intertwined with the arts of civilization. In the quiet, sun-drenched chambers of the Bavarian court, the air was frequently filled with the rhythmic, hypnotic clacking of the vertical, warp-weighted looms. Gisela would watch for hours as the master weavers, their fingers moving with practiced, effortless grace, guided the wooden shuttles back and forth through the tightly stretched threads. The sound was a comforting constant, a gentle heartbeat that seemed to anchor the entire household. In these rooms, the fine aroma of imported Mediterranean wool blended seamlessly with the green, grassy scent of local flax drying in the courtyards, creating an environment that felt both industrious and profoundly serene. It was in these spaces that Gisela learned to appreciate the true nature of textiles. She came to understand that a piece of cloth was never merely a material good. It was a testament to patience and intricate geometry where thousands of individual, fragile strands were bound together to create something strong, durable, and protective. She felt the cool, smooth texture of high-quality linen under her fingertips and observed how carefully regulated dye vats could transform pale, dull wool into deep indigo, rich madder red, and warm, golden ochre. This wasn't merely a pastime for noble ladies, but a vital pillars of societal well-being, providing comfort against the elements and dignity to the community. The education of a Bavarian princess extended far beyond the aesthetic appreciation of craft. Gisela was taught the meticulous logistics of production, how to calculate the yield of a flax harvest, how to manage the storage of raw materials to prevent rot, and how to organize networks of weavers so that no household was left without work during the idle winter months. She saw how her family's estates flourished when craftsmanship was given a sacred central place within the daily routine. The discipline required to keep a loom perfectly tensioned reflected the discipline needed to guide a young nation, a realization that settled deeply into her quiet, contemplative mind. As the years passed and the time approached for her to journey east to fulfill her destiny as the bride of King Stephen, Gisela did not fill her baggage trains with weapons or heavy, ostentatious golden ornaments. Instead, she chose to carry the tools of peace, packed carefully into deep wooden chests, wrapped in protective layers of oiled cloth, were high-grade iron shears, carved bone spindle walls, detailed manuscript patterns, and bags of precious seeds for cultivating the finest varieties of flax. She brought with her the quiet, unyielding determination to build, to heal, and to introduce the soothing, civilizing music of the loom to a land that had known only the restless movement of the open saddle. The royal procession that escorted Princess Gisela across the eastern borders of Bavaria and into the heart of the Hungarian kingdom moved with a slow, dignified pace. The heavy wooden wagons rumbled softly over the unpaved tracks, their iron-shod wheels pressing deep into the soft, dark earth of the Danube Valley. As the green, forested hills of her homeland gradually flattened into the immense, open horizons of the Pannonian Plains, the young bride gazed out at her new domain. The landscape was vast and breathtaking, an endless expanse of earth and sky where the wind moved through the tall grasses like waves upon a silent ocean. It was a land of raw, untapped potential, possessing a wild beauty that contrasted sharply with the ordered estates and stone-walled towns of her youth. When she reached the royal seat of Veszprém, she brought no armies or instruments of conquest. Her retinue consisted of builders, scribes, stone carvers, and most importantly, skilled weavers who carried with them the cumulative knowledge of Western European craftsmanship. The local people, still accustomed to a semi-nomadic lifestyle where clothing was often made from poorly treated skins or loose, unevenly spun wool, watched the arrival of the new queen with a mixture of curiosity and quiet reservation. Gisela did not seek to uproot their traditions with force. Instead, she chose to introduce her ways gently, like a seed planted in fertile soil, allowing the practical benefits of her knowledge to reveal themselves over time. Inside the palace walls, the queen began unpacking the treasures she had brought from the west. The deep wooden chests were opened, releasing the scent of cedar wood, dried lavender, and the clean, crisp aroma of German flax. Out came the iron combs for dressing raw fibers, the smoothly polished bone distaffs, and the heavy lead weights used to tension the vertical threads of the loom. To the local inhabitants, these objects looked strange and complex, but Gisela handled them with an easy, reassuring familiarity. She understood that before a people could find peace in their hearts, they needed to find physical comfort and security in their daily lives. shielded from the unforgiving environment that surrounded them. Under her quiet direction, a section of the palace courtyards was transformed into a gathering place for learning. She invited the daughters and wives of the local chieftains, as well as women from the surrounding agricultural villages, to join her in these bright, open spaces. There was no pressure or harsh discipline. The queen simply sat among them, a spindle whorl balanced perfectly in her lap, her fingers working the raw wool with a rhythmic, mesmerizing motion. The silent language of the hands began to bridge the gap between two distinct cultures, as the women observed the fine, uniform thread that emerged from the queen's hands, far superior to anything they had seen before. As the afternoon sun cast long, golden beams through the arcade of the courtyard, the atmosphere grew increasingly calm and focused. The sharp, unfamiliar sounds of a foreign language melted away, replaced by the universal, comforting murmur of women working together in a shared space. Gisela showed them how to balance the spindle, how to tease out the fibers with the fingertips without breaking the strand, and how to value the slow, steady progress of manual labor. This quiet courtyard became the birthplace of a new domestic industry, a sanctuary where the foundational threads of a unified society were being spun, one slow turn at a time. The channel is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. As the weeks passed, the golden hues of autumn vanished entirely from the Pannonian plains, replaced by the stark, monochromatic tones of a severe winter. The great Danube River, once a fluid ribbon of silver and slate, slowed to a silent crawl before locking completely under a thick, jagged sheet of ice. The wind, howling down from the northern peaks without any forests to break its momentum, swept across the open valleys, carrying fine, powdery snow that drifted high against the mud-brick walls of the rural hamlets. Every blade of grass on the steppes was encased in a fragile shell of rime, and the breath of both man and beast rose into the freezing air like thick white plumes of smoke, dissipating quickly into the grey sky. In the small villages outside the protection of the royal towns, this season brought a heavy, enduring hardship. The simple huts, built from wattle and daub with roofs of dried reed thatch, struggled to keep the penetrating dampness at bay. Inside, the floors of packed earth grew cold as stone, radiating a chill that crept up through the thin layers of straw bedding. The people wrapped themselves in whatever they possessed, mostly rough, stiff sheepskins that had been poorly cured, or coarse garments woven from wild nettle and low-grade hemp. These fabrics were thick but brittle, riddled with gaps between the uneven threads, allowing the icy drafts to pierce straight through to the skin. The physical toll of this lack of adequate clothing was evident in every household. Mothers spent their days trying to keep their infants close to the central fire pit, where the smoke often became thick and acrid due to the green wood gathered from the frozen thickets. Children, shivering in their scratchy, unyielding tunics, huddled together under thin covers, their skin chapped and red from the biting cold. The elderly sat quietly in the corners, their joints aching from the pervasive humidity that settled into the bone. Without dense, tightly woven textiles to trap the body's natural heat, the winter was not just a time of rest, but a long, exhausting struggle for survival against the invisible weight of the frost. The reliance on bounteous harvest years made these winter months an anxious period of waiting. If the summer had been too dry or the autumn rains too heavy, the grain stores would be low, and the lack of physical comfort inside the home only amplified the sense of vulnerability. There was a profound stillness in the air, a heavy silence born from the fact that outdoor work was nearly impossible. The fields were frozen solid, the tools of agriculture hung uselessly on the walls, and the people were trapped indoors by the snowdrifts, left with little to do but watch the firewood burn down to white ash while the cold pressed relentlessly against their doors. It was during these dark, frozen months that the true necessity of Queen Gisela's vision became clearest. The absolute dependency on the whims of nature and the lack of an internal protective craft left the population fragile. The kingdom could not truly grow or find stability while its people spent half of every year simply trying to survive the climate in discomfort. The solution lay not in seeking warmth from larger fires that consumed the scarce timber, but in creating a barrier of woven insulation, a secondary skin engineered by human hands to preserve life and dignity through the coldest nights of the year. Inside the dim interiors of the village huts, the long winter night stretched out in an endless, quiet expanse. As the last pale light of the sun vanished behind the western hills, the world outside was swallowed by a deep, velvety blackness, leaving each household isolated in its own small circle of firelight. The embers at the center of the room throbbed with a low, rhythmic orange pulse, casting long dancing shadows across the low ceilings and the heavy timber pillars that supported the thatch. The air was still and close, smelling faintly of old wood smoke. Dried moss used to seal the walls, and the sweet, resinous aroma of pine knots burning slowly in the dark. For hours the families sat in this enclosed sanctuary, listening to the winter wind rake across the frozen reed roofs. In the absence of daytime labours, a heavy contemplative silence settled over the hearth. The older men sat cross-legged on the earth, their weathered faces etched deep with the lines of past migrations and hard seasons, staring into the shifting geometry of the flames. Occasionally a dry branch would crackle and snap, sending a brief cascade of golden sparks swirling up toward the smoke hole, illuminating for a fleeting second the simple pottery and wooden bowls stacked neatly upon the shelves. In these quiet hours, the yearning for physical comfort became a tangible presence in the room. The children, exhausted from the simple effort of staying warm, curled together on pallets of dry ferns and straw, their fitful sleep disturbed by the draughts that chased across the floor. Mothers would constantly reach out to pull the coarse, scratchy blankets back over their shoulders, feeling the rough texture of the fabric and wishing for something softer, tighter, and more protective to shield their families. There was a profound vulnerability in this stillness, a collective realization that the thin walls of mud and the uneven weave of their garments were all that stood between them and the immense, freezing void of the medieval night. Yet, despite the cold, these long evenings also held a quiet potential. Stripped of the distractions of the brighter seasons, the mind turned naturally toward memory and the slow passing of lore. In the soft light, the grandmothers would begin to speak in low, melodic tones, their voices rising and falling in harmony with the sighing wind outside. They told ancient stories of stars that guided travelers across wide rivers, of ancient spirits that slept beneath the roots of the world, and of a distant, legendary spring that would eventually break the iron grip of the ice. The listeners would close their eyes, allowing the familiar cadence of the tales to drift through their thoughts like smoke. As the midnight hour approached, the fire would gradually die down to a bed of soft, glowing ash, and the shadows would deepen into a protective embrace. The cold would press closer, but the shared warmth of the family kept the deepest frost at bay. In this quiet crucible of the winter hearth, the people waited with a quiet, enduring patience. They were anchored to the earth, preserved by the slow rhythm of the night, waiting for the first signs of a changing season and the new, transformative wisdom that was beginning to radiate outward from the stone halls of the Queen's court. With the arrival of the first pale thaws of early spring, the iron grip of the winter ice began to soften around the royal citadel of Vesprem. Queen Gisela would often walk along the high limestone ramparts as the morning mist rose slowly from the valleys below, watching the landscape shed its coat of white. The earth was waking up, releasing a rich, damp scent of dark soil, melted snow, and the sweet, resinous breath of pine forests warming under the pale sun. As she looked out over the rolling hills, her mind was not occupied with thoughts of territorial expansion, but with a quiet, systematic examination of the natural resources that lay dormant within the Hungarian soil. She noticed the vast expanses of alluvial meadows along the riverbanks, recognizing them as the perfect environment for cultivating high-quality flax and hemp. Her trained eyes observed the wild herbs beginning to push through the damp leaf litter in the valleys, woodruff, bedstraw, and wild madder, plants that her native Bavarian weavers used to unlock brilliant shades of crimson and gold from raw wool. Gisela understood that the true wealth of her new kingdom was not hidden in secret vaults of coin, but was waiting to be drawn directly from the earth through patience, structure, and the organized application of human skill. Under her guidance, the court at Veszprém became a bustling center of domestic planning. The long winter of waiting had ended, and the queen began to mobilize her household, establishing a network of communication with the surrounding settlements. She walked through the castle grounds, selecting large, well-ventilated chambers with tall windows that faced the morning light, designating them as the future heart of her textile initiatives. Her steps were quiet and deliberate, her voice low and reassuring as she gave instructions to the stone carvers and woodworkers, creating an atmosphere of calm purpose that quickly spread from the palace down into the valley below. The local women, seeing the Queen's deep involvement in these practical matters, began to gather at the castle gates with a renewed sense of interest. They brought with them the rough materials they had gathered during the winter, eager to see how the foreign queen would transform them. Gisela received them with a gentle grace, sitting on a low wooden bench in the open courtyard surrounded by the fresh green scents of the awakening spring. She showed them how to look at the landscape not just as a place of labor, but as a vast library of materials, where every plant and every fleece held the potential to bring comfort and beauty into their homes. As the sun reached its noon height, warming the ancient stones of Veszprém, a profound sense of peace settled over the valley. The long defensive posture of the winter was finally being replaced by a creative awakening. The Queen's vision was beginning to take root in the minds of her people, transforming the court from a remote fortress into a sanctuary of shared knowledge, where the foundation for a prosperous, self-sufficient culture was being laid down with the gentlest of touches. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales, gently curated and narrated based on themes such as the rise and fall of nations, human cultures, and extraordinary journeys through time. As the spring deepened and turned into the long golden days of early summer, the valleys surrounding Veszprém transformed into fields of vibrant green. Under the gentle guidance of Queen Gisela, the first planned crops of cultivated flax began to mature alongside the sturdy stands of wild hemp that grew abundantly in the moist, rich soil near the riverbeds. The queen would often venture into these fields accompanied by her maidens and village elders, her long linen sleeves pulled back as she waded into the high stalks. The air was warm and heavy with the sweet honey-like scent of tiny blue flax blossoms dancing in the summer breeze, a visual harmony that seemed to mirror the quiet peace settled over the land. The process of harvesting these fibers was one of immense patience and careful deliberation. Unlike grain, which was cut with sharp, ringing scythes, flax had to be pulled gently from the earth by its roots to preserve the full, unbroken length of its internal fibers. Gisela showed the village women how to wrap their fingers around the base of the stalks, pulling upward with a smooth, continuous motion that respected the plant's structure. The sound of the roots tearing softly from the damp earth was a quiet, earthy cadence, accompanied by the steady hum of honeybees foraging in the nearby clover. Once gathered, the long stalks were laid out in neat, uniform rows upon the grass to dry under the summer sun. The green colour slowly faded to a pale straw-like gold, and the sweet aroma of drying vegetation filled the river valleys, blending with the crisp, clean smell of the moving water. The queen would walk among the rows, picking up individual stems, bending them between her fingers to check the brittleness of the woody outer bark. This stage required an intimate connection with the materials and understanding that could not be rushed by anger or ambition, but only nurtured through constant, gentle observation. Following the drying, the stalks were subjected to the ancient process of retting, where they were submerged in the shallow, slow-moving pools of the river. Weighted down with smooth, water-worn river stones, the flax remained beneath the surface for days, allowing the moisture and natural elements to soften the gums holding the fibers together. The atmosphere around the retting pools was serene. The only sounds were the soft lapping of the current against the stones and the occasional cry of a heron rising from the reeds. It was a period of unseen transformation, where the elements of water and earth worked together to refine the raw gifts of the soil. When the fibers were finally lifted from the water and dried once more, the women began the work of breaking and scutching, using wooden mallets to crush the brittle outer shell, and release the long, silky strands hidden within. As the wooden tools met the flax, a fine, clean dust rose into the air, catching the long beams of afternoon sunlight like golden mist. Underneath the rough exterior, the true treasure revealed itself. Ribbons of pale, silver-grey fibre, incredibly soft to the touch yet possessed of an enduring strength. The women smiled as they ran the smooth strands through their worn palms, realizing that the wild fields they had walked for generations were finally yielding the secret to an enduring, protective warmth. Within the quiet, thick limestone walls of the newly established monasteries, a profound transformation was taking place. These stone sanctuaries, designed with high, rounded arches and narrow, deep-set windows, were built to withstand the passage of time and the harsh changes of the seasons. Inside, the atmosphere was inherently cool and solemn, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp mortar, fresh whitewash, and the clean, sweet aroma of beeswax candles burning steadily in the alcoves. For months, these spaces had been reserved exclusively for the quiet scratching of goose quills over parchment, but under Queen Gisela's thoughtful direction, several large, sunlit scriptoriums were cleared to accommodate a different kind of devotion. The heavy oak tables, once piled high with theological manuscripts, were moved gently against the stone walls, making room for the broad open floors required by the weavers. The morning sunbeams streamed through the east-facing windows, illuminating millions of tiny golden dust motes, dancing in the silent air and casting long, geometric blocks of light across the smooth flagstones. This integration of intellectual sanctuary and manual craft created an environment of supreme focus and tranquility. The monks and layout assistants moved with soft, measured steps, their heavy wool habits rustling gently against the stone as they prepared the workspace for the incoming artisans. To the Queen, the choice of these sacred spaces was entirely deliberate. She understood that the advanced techniques of textile production required a level of concentration, patience, and order that mirrored the spiritual discipline found within the monastic walls. By placing the workshops under the protection of the cloisters, she insulated the craft from the chaotic disruptions of the outside world. Here, far removed from the anxieties of politics and tribal rivalries, the weavers could focus entirely on the perfection of their movements, turning the simple act of interlacing threads into a silent, meditative prayer for the well-being of the realm. In the corners of these cleared rooms, large linen sacks filled with processed flax and neatly bundled skeins of raw wool were stacked with meticulous care. The natural, rustic scent of the animal fibers blended with the clean, crisp smell of the dried plant materials, creating a rich, reassuring sensory landscape that filled the scriptorium. The thick stone walls kept the summer heat at bay, maintaining a perfectly regulated temperature that prevented the delicate linen threads from drying out and snapping under tension. It was a space suspended in time where everything was balanced, deliberate, and designed to foster the growth of an enduring artistry. As the afternoon light shifted, casting deep amber reflections across the high-vaulted ceilings, the silence of the scriptorium became a protective shield. The artisans who entered these rooms left their daily burdens at the heavy oak doors, stepping into a world where the only requirement was a steady eye and a patient hand. Under the quiet guidance of the Queen's master craftsmen, the foundation was laid for an era of structured industry, demonstrating to all who watched that the creation of true comfort and beauty required a sanctuary of peace, order, and undisturbed devotion. Outside the thick stone walls of the palace workshops, the deep aromatic woods of the Bacony Hills provided the vital raw materials for Queen Gisela's grand design. Under her quiet guidance, the local woodworkers, men whose ancestors had carved simple bows and wooden saddle frames, ventured into the ancient forests to select the perfect timbers. They sought out straight, seasoned oak and sturdy ash that had grown slowly over decades, developing a dense, unyielding grain. The air in the forest clearings was cool and fresh, filled with the rich scent of damp moss, crushed pine needles, and the clean, bitter aroma of fresh sap rising from the wood as the craftsmen split the heavy logs into uniform beams. The wood was brought back to the castle courtyards, where it was laid out under the shade of broad elm trees to be worked with immense care. Using heavy iron broadaxes and hand-drawn adzes, the The carpenters shaved the rough bark away, revealing the pale, cream-coloured heartwood beneath. Every stroke of the tool was measured and deliberate, a rhythmic shaving that produced long, curling ribbons of wood that blanketed the courtyard floor. The Queen would occasionally walk through these outdoor workshops, her soft leather shoes stepping quietly through the fragrant shavings as she stopped to run her fingers over the smoothed surfaces, ensuring there were no splinters or rough edges that might catch and tear a delicate linen thread. Under the direction of the Bavarian master carpenters, the raw timbers were gradually assembled into the first grand upright warp-weighted looms. These structures were tall and imposing, standing well over the height of a man, consisting of two heavy vertical uprights connected at the top by a thick rotating beam called the cloth beam. The design was ancient and proven, requiring no iron nails or complex metal brackets. Instead, the woodworkers joined the frames using sturdy mortise and tenon joints, secured with tightly fitting wooden pegs. The sound of the wooden mallets tapping the pegs into place was a solid, reassuring heartbeat that echoed softly off the limestone palace walls. As the heavy frames were completed, they were moved one by one into the quiet, cleared chambers of the palace and the nearby monasteries. Placed at a slight angle against the stone walls, the looms stood like silent monuments to a new way of living. The natural oils of the wood filled the indoor spaces, blending with the lingering scent of beeswax and dried herbs to create an atmosphere that felt deeply grounded, stable and protective. Each frame was a masterpiece of simple geometry, perfectly balanced to bear the immense structural tension of hundreds of vertical threads. To stabilize the lower edge of the loom, local potters were enlisted to bake heavy donut-shaped loom weights from dark iron-rich clay. These weights, fired slowly in wood-burning kilns until they achieved a dull, metallic ring, were designed to hang from the bottom of the warp threads, pulling them perfectly taut. The combination of the heavy, pale forest timber and the dark, fired clay weights represented a beautiful union of the kingdom's natural elements. As the woodworkers stepped back to admire their completed frames, a profound stillness settled over the workshops, a quiet preparation for the moment when these silent wooden structures would be brought to life by the touch of the weaver's hand. Inside the spacious sunlit chambers of the Veszprém court, a deep, concentrated quiet fell upon the gathering of women. From the high-born daughters of local chieftains to the humble mothers from the valley settlements, dozens had answered Queen Gisela's quiet invitation to master the foundational art of spinning. They sat in wide concentric circles on low benches and woven straw mats, their skirts rustling softly as they adjusted their postures. The morning light filtered through the tall arched windows, illuminating the pale silver-grey bundles of combed flax and the snowy tufts of washed sheep's wool that lay stacked beside them, filling the room with a clean, rustic aroma of dried grass and natural lanolin. At the centre of this gathering, the Queen demonstrated the technique with an effortless, mesmerising fluid motion. In her left hand she held the wooden distaff, a slender staff around which a cloud of loose, unspun flax was loosely bound with a silk ribbon. With her right hand she gently teased out a few delicate strands of fibre, twisting them lightly between her thumb and forefinger before securing them to the notch of a small, perfectly weighted drop spindle. With a deft, subtle flick of her wrist, she set the spindle spinning into the air just above the floorboards, its polished bone wall rotating with a low, whisper-like hum. The women watched in absolute silence, captivated by the hypnotic sight of the suspended spindle spinning steadily in the golden dust motes. As it whirled, the loose, chaotic mass of fibres was drawn downward, transforming into a single uniform thread of immense strength and consistency. Gisela's fingers moved with a precise, almost invisible touch, regulating the flow of the fibre with a gentle sensitivity that required complete stillness of mind. There was no rushing, no forceful pulling. The yarn seemed to create itself out of the air, guided only by the quiet cooperation between the spinner's touch and the downward pull of gravity. Slowly, the women began to emulate the Queen's movements, and the room filled with the soft, collective murmur of a new language. At first there were small sighs of frustration as threads snapped or spindles wobbled and clattered against the stone floor, But Gisela moved patiently through the rows, her hands warm and reassuring as she placed her fingers over theirs, showing them how to feel the tension of the fibre and how to balance the weight of the wall. She taught them that the spindle could not be mastered through anxiety or haste, but required a rhythmic, peaceful surrender to the natural properties of the material. As the hours drifted by, the clatter of dropped spindles faded, replaced by the steady, soothing symphony of dozens of walls spinning in perfect unison. A profound sense of shared purpose settled over the chamber, bridging all gaps of language and status. The air grew warm and comfortable, sweet with the scent of lavender oil used to condition the wooden tools. Each woman sat anchored in her own quiet rhythm, watching the pale thread grow longer and wind neatly around the shaft of her spindle, realizing that through this simple, repetitive motion, they were slowly drawing out the raw material that would shield their entire culture from the cold. As the long days of summer reached their golden peak, the focus of Queen Gisela's workshops expanded from the structural creation of thread to the ancient, transformative art of coloration. Under her gentle guidance, groups of women and young girls ventured beyond the castle walls into the rich, damp lowlands and the shaded fringes of the ancient forests. They carried with them deep wicker baskets woven from river willows, moving slowly and deliberately through the landscape. The morning air was fresh and sweet, filled with the aroma of damp earth, crushed ferns, and the warm, wild scent of fields baking under the summer sun, creating an atmosphere of profound tranquility as they began to gather the gifts of the wild. The search for natural dyes required a deep, respectful knowledge of the local flora, an understanding of the secret properties hidden within seemingly humble plants. The gatherers moved with patience, kneeling in the soft grass to carefully uproot the wild madder plants, whose long, sprawling roots held the secret to deep, vibrant crimson reds. In the sunlit clearings they gathered baskets of yellow bedstraw and weld, while near the marshy banks of the streams they collected the bark of young alder trees and the thick, green husks of wild walnuts. Every plant was selected with care, its gathering accompanied by the steady, soothing hum of cicadas in the high branches and the gentle rustle of leaves in the summer breeze. Back within the stone courtyards of the palace, these natural treasures were prepared for the dye vats with a meticulous, rhythmic precision. The long madder roots were washed in clear spring water, removing the dark river soil until their rich orange-red core was revealed and then crushed gently between smooth stones. The walnut husks were chopped into coarse pieces, releasing a rich, bitter, oily aroma that drifted across the stones, blending with the sweet honey-like scent of drying chamomile and marigolds. This preparation was a slow, meditative process where the physical elements of the landscape were carefully concentrated, filling the outdoor air with a deep, earthy perfume that spoke of comfort, stability, and abundance. To the Queen, this colourful harvest represented more than just visual decoration. It was an integration of the kingdom's identity into the very fabric of its daily life. She walked through the courtyards, her soft leather shoes clicking gently on the flagstones as she inspected the baskets of leaves, roots, and bark. She showed the local girls how to identify the peak maturity of a plant, how to dry the herbs without losing their potency, and how to store them in neat canvas bags to preserve their colouring properties for the winter months. Her presence brought a calm reassurance to the industrious scene, transforming the hard work of gathering into a shared ritual of discovery. As the afternoon sun cast long golden beams across the piled baskets of vegetation, the courtyard felt completely insulated from the anxieties of the outside world. The rich, varied colours of the raw materials, the deep greens of the alder leaves, the rich browns of the bark, and the bright yellows of the fields lay arranged like a natural tapestry upon the grey stones. The people looked at these gathered riches with a quiet sense of pride and anticipation, knowing that the wild, untamed hills they called home were finally being understood and unlocked, ready to yield their hidden beauty to soften the cold texture of their lives. In the broad stone courtyard adjoining the palace kitchens, the transformation of the gathered roots and barks began under a low, clear sky. Heavy bronze and iron vats, balanced carefully over pits of glowing oak embers, were filled to the brim with sweet spring water hauled up from the castle wells. As the heat rose slowly through the metal, the water began to simmer, sending up thick, swirling plumes of fragrant steam that drifted lazily across the stone arcades. The air became heavy with a rich, complex perfume, a deeply comforting blend of the earthy bitterness of boiled walnut husks, the sweet, fruity tang of crushed elderberries, and the deep, resinous scent of wild madder roots softening in the heat. The Queen's master dyers moved around the steaming cauldrons with practiced, deliberate motions, using long oars of smooth ash wood to stir the simmering mixtures. With each slow turn of the paddle, the clear water changed colour, unlocking the hidden vitality of the soil. The madder root vat gradually deepened from a pale amber to a rich velvety crimson red, while the cauldron filled with walnut husks dissolved into a dense warm shade of chestnut brown. The surface of the liquids shimmered with a soft, oily sheen, catching the golden afternoon light and casting swirling, iridescent reflections across the limestone faces of the surrounding buildings. Once the dye liquors had reached their full potency, the skeins of spun flax and wool, which had been washed and soaked in gentle mineral mordants, were lowered into the vats. The dry, pale fibres drank the coloured waters thirstily, sinking below the surface with a soft, bubbling sigh. The weavers watched with quiet fascination as the raw wool, once dull and uniform, emerged from the bubbling depths, transformed, glowing with the deep, saturated hues of the earth. This slow alchemy required absolute patience. If the water was too hot, the delicate wool would shrink and harden, but under the careful, watchful eyes of the artisans, the temperature was maintained at a perfect, steady simmer. As the afternoon matured, the coloured yarns were lifted from the cauldrons using long wooden tongs, allowing the excess dye to drain back into the steaming vats with a steady, rhythmic dripping sound that echoed off the stones. The wet wool and linen fibres possessed a glossy, rich density, their colours appearing deeper and more vibrant while wet. The courtyard had become a living canvas, filled with the warmth of the fires, the soothing sounds of bubbling water, and the ancient protective aromas of the plant world. It was a scene of profound domestic peace, where the natural elements of the kingdom were being harmonized to bring warmth and dignity to its people. If you find peace in these quiet journeys through the ancient tapestries of human history, consider taking a gentle moment to subscribe, like, and share this story with others who seek a sanctuary of calm reflection before sleep. Across the wide stone courtyards and along the covered wooden galleries of the Veszprém citadel, long horizontal poles of polished pine were suspended between the pillars to receive the freshly dyed yarns. As the gentle autumn breeze swept down from the hills, carrying the crisp, clean scent of changing leaves and distant wood smoke, the weavers began hanging the heavy, saturated skeins to dry. One by one, the damp bundles of wool and linen were draped over the wooden perches, their wet fibres straightening under the weight of the water. The grey limestone walls of the castle, which had stood for years as a monochrome fortress of defence, were suddenly transformed into a spectacular, soft canvas of living colour. The visual display was breathtaking in its rustic simplicity. Long rows of deep madder red hung alongside rich, warm ochre derived from forest weld, while the chestnut browns of walnut husks provided a solid grounding counterpoint. In the soft light of the late afternoon sun, the hanging threads caught the fading beams, glowing like rows of spun amber and crushed jewels against the pale stone background. The air in the galleries was wonderfully fresh, sweet with the clean, green smell of wet linen and the rich, comforting oiliness of natural sheep's wool, creating a sensory landscape that felt profoundly secure and abundant. As the wind moved through the galleries, the coloured yarns swayed gently in unison, a silent, undulating tapestry that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the courtyard itself. Small droplets of coloured water fell occasionally to the dry flagstones below with a soft, rhythmic patter, leaving temporary patterns on the stone that faded quickly in the breeze. The Queen would walk through these covered walkways in the twilight, her fingers brushing lightly against the drying skeins. She felt the texture of the yarn changing as the moisture evaporated, growing softer, fluffier, and infinitely more inviting to the touch. This abundance of colour brought a subtle but profound shift in the psychological atmosphere of the court. The vibrant hues promised a winter that would look entirely different from the bleak, icy seasons of the past. It was a physical manifestation of readiness, an assurance that the dark days ahead would be met with warmth and beauty. The local women who had helped prepare the dyes stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching the wind play through the threads they had helped create, their faces illuminated by a quiet sense of accomplishment and pride. By the time the stars began to appear in the deep indigo sky, the dampness had left most of the wool, leaving the skeins light, voluminous, and incredibly soft. They were gathered down from the poles with gentle, reverent movements, folded carefully into deep wicker baskets lined with clean linen sheetings. The dry yarn retained the faint, pleasant aroma of the wild herbs and forest barks from which its colours had been born. Packed away in the dark storage vaults of the palace, these bundles of amber, ochre, and crimson stood ready, a silent reserve of comfort waiting to be fed into the hungry frames of the waiting looms. Inside the high-vaulted weaving chambers, the morning brought a shift toward the most demanding and precise phase of the entire process, setting the warp upon the tall wooden frames. The heavy, upright, warp-weighted looms stood in long, solemn rows against the limestone walls, their freshly shaved pine and ash timbers catching the pale light from the eastern windows. The air in the room was cool, perfectly still, and filled with the clean, crisp aroma of natural flax blended with the faint, sweet scent of beeswax used to smooth the wooden beams. On this day, all noise was hushed. The weavers moved with a deliberate, slow grace, knowing that the structural integrity of the entire fabric depended upon the absolute accuracy of these first structural lines. The process of measuring the warp threads required a mathematical precision that resembled a silent ritual. Master weavers, their eyes sharp and focused, stood before long horizontal warping boards pegged into the walls, guiding the fine linen threads back and forth across the wooden pegs. They measured hundreds of individual strands, each exactly equal in length, ensuring that the tension across the entire width of the future cloth would be perfectly uniform. The thin, pale threads made a soft, whisper-like sound as they were drawn from the spinning balls, a gentle cadence that filled the room like the rustle of dry autumn leaves in a quiet orchard. Once measured, the bundles of warp threads were brought to the top of the heavy looms, where they had to be secured to the rotating cloth beam. This task required two artisans working in perfect harmony, one standing high upon a wooden bench, carefully knotting the groups of threads around the upper rod, while another stood below, gently smoothing the long cascading strands with open palms to prevent any twisting or tangling. The linen threads fell down the face of the loom like a silver waterfall, a dense screen of vertical lines that split the morning sunlight into tiny, shimmering geometric beams across the stone floor. To complete the setup, the lower ends of the warp threads were divided into neat, small bundles and tied to the heavy clay weights that rested near the floorboards. As each weight was released, its heavy, dark iron clay mass pulled the vertical threads taut, causing them to hum softly like the low strings of a distant harp. The sound was a deep, satisfying tone that signaled the loom was finally under tension, ready to receive the active touch of the weaver. This precise balancing act required an intimate understanding of the fiber's limits. Too much weight would snap the fragile lines, while too little would cause the weave to become loose and drafty. By the time the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long golden bars across the flagstones, the rows of looms were fully dressed. Hundreds of taut, parallel threads stretched from top to bottom, completely transforming the space into a structured forest of lines. The weavers stood back, their hands resting quietly on the wooden uprights, taking a slow moment to inspect the absolute straightness of the warp. The frame was no longer just a collection of timber and clay. It had become an engineered instrument of order, a perfect canvas of tension waiting for the silent passage of the shuttle to begin its work. A sacred hush fell over the great weaving hall as Queen Gisela herself stepped before the central loom to initiate the first active weaving of the season. The room was warmed by a gentle fire burning in the corner hearth, its orange glow flickering softly against the smooth limestone walls and casting a warm light across the dressed warp threads. The air carried the clean, rustic smell of dried flax, the rich aroma of natural lanolin from the dyed wool skeins, and the faint sweet scent of cedar wood shavings. With a calm, measured breath, the queen took the heavy wooden shuttle, carved from a single piece of seasoned plum wood and polished until it was smooth as silk, and held it loosely in her hand. With her left hand she gently pulled the loom's heddle rod forward, a movement that shifted alternating warp threads to create a clear triangular path, known as the shed. Through the vertical screen of lines, the taut linen strands brushed against one another with a soft collective whisper like the rustle of dry reeds along the banks of a quiet river. Then, with a smooth, effortless sweep of her arm, she slid the wooden shuttle through the gap. The shuttle glided effortlessly between the threads, trailing behind it a rich strand of deep madder red woolen yarn that stood out in brilliant contrast against the pale grey warp. As the shuttle emerged on the opposite side, catching the sunlight, it met the receiving hand of a young apprentice with a gentle, satisfying click. The queen then took the heavy wooden weaving comb, lifting it to press the newly laid horizontal weft thread firmly upward into the apex of the frame. The rhythmic tapping of the comb against the wood was a solid grounding sound that echoed softly off the high-vaulted ceilings, a steady, deliberate heartbeat that signaled the practical birth of a new industry for the young kingdom. It was a single line of cloth, small and humble, but it represented a monumental step toward permanent comfort and structure. The other weavers in the hall, inspired by the queen's flawless demonstration, stepped before their own frames and took up their shuttles. Within moments, the room filled with a magnificent, soothing symphony of domestic labour. The rhythmic clacking of the wooden shuttles sliding back and forth, the soft sigh of the shifting warp threads, and the steady, low thud of the weaving combs beating the fabric tight blended into a hypnotic, continuous cadence. It was a music that did not jar or startle, but rather settled into the mind like the steady patter of a summer rain on a shingle roof, wiping away all thoughts of chaos and replacing them with a profound sense of orderly peace. As the afternoon light faded into a warm golden twilight, a few inches of dense, beautiful cloth had begun to appear at the top of each loom. The herringbone and tabby patterns emerged with perfect mathematical regularity, a testament to the focused minds and steady hands of the artisans. The queen walked slowly down the long aisle between the frames, listening to the harmonious chorus of the wood and fibre. The long days of harvesting, retting, spinning and dyeing were finally coalescing into a tangible reality. The looms were alive, beating out a steady rhythm of protection that promised to wrap the entire nation in warmth, one quiet thread at a time. As the autumn days grew shorter and the workshop settled into a deep, unwavering routine, a subtle yet profound transformation began to manifest in the physical lives of the weavers themselves. Many of the women who filled the long rows before the looms were daughters of the soil, individuals whose entire lives had been defined by the uncompromising, exhausting demands of outdoor agricultural labour. Their hands were a testament to that history, bearing skin that had been calloused by the rough wooden shafts of heavy iron hoes, palms that were deeply lined from pulling stubborn wild roots from the damp earth, and fingertips that had grown split and hardened by the bitter frost of past harvests. But within the sheltered, temperate sanctuaries of the palace weaving rooms, a different kind of interaction with the material world began to rewrite those physical marks. Hour after hour, day after day, these hardened fingers worked intimately with the raw components of the textile craft. They handled the long, silky strands of dressed flax, which possessed a natural microscopic suppleness, and they guided the voluminous skeins of virgin sheep's wool. This wool, harvested with care from the native flocks, was still richly saturated with lanolin, the natural protective wax secreted by the sheep to shield their fleece from the mountain downpours. As the weavers pulled the wool through their palms and smoothed the cascading threads of the warp, their skin absorbed these fine biological oils. Gradually, the deep, painful cracks in their fingertips began to heal, sealing over with a new flexible resilience. The rough, abrasive calluses that had caught on fine fabrics began to wear down, replaced by a smooth, sensitive pliancy that allowed them to feel the slightest variation in a thread's thickness. It was an unexpected, gentle medicine, a physical restoration that came not from a medicinal jar but from the very act of creation itself, softening the outermost layer of their hard lives. This physical softening brought with it a distinct change in the way the women viewed their own labour. The pain and numbness that had often accompanied a long day in the frozen fields were absent here. Instead, their hands felt warm, alive, and increasingly capable of delicate precision. They would occasionally pause between the throws of the shuttle, holding their palms up to the golden light of the tall windows, marvelling at the strange, soft texture of their own skin. The work was demanding, requiring hours of focused attention, but it was a labour that nourished the body rather than consuming it, leaving them with a profound sense of physical dignity. To Queen Gisela, watching from the quiet gallery above, this was perhaps the truest victory of her initiative. The transformation of her people was happening on the most intimate level, starting at the very fingertips that dizzily threw the plumwood shuttles. The hands that had once known only the heavy, unyielding resistance of the earth were now learning the sophisticated, sensitive geometry of the loom. In the quiet music of the workshop, surrounded by the warm, comforting scent of oiled timber and clean fleece, the weavers were not just manipulating the threads. They were experiencing a gentle, systemic softening of their world, preparing them to handle the future with a refined, peaceful grace. As the winter solstice approached, locking the valleys once more in a silent armour of ice, the atmosphere within the weaving halls remained perfectly regulated, warm, and intently focused. The artisans had advanced beyond the simplest motions of the loom, moving with a calm confidence into the sophisticated mathematical precision required to create complex fabric patterns. Before each tall wooden frame, the weaver stood as a quiet geometer, translating numbers and intervals into a physical shield against the elements. The air in the vast room was still, carrying the clean, dry scent of tensioned linen and the rich, natural musk of dyed wool yarns, while the low light of the afternoon sun cast long, precise grids of shadow across the stone floorboards. The primary structure taking shape on many of the looms was the classic tabby weave, the oldest and most dependable form of interlacing. It required a simple, unyielding alternation, one thread over, one thread under, repeated across the entire width of the warp. This pattern demanded a steady, unchanging rhythm, an absolute consistency in the way the weaver pressed the wooden comb against the newly laid weft. The resulting fabric was flat, dense, and uniform, possessing an enduring strength that would not easily snag or pull apart when subjected to the hard friction of daily village life. To look at a finished section of tabby cloth was to see order materialized, a perfect grid where every crossing of thread was a testament to a quiet, undisturbed mind. On other frames, reserved for the finest wool blankets and heavy winter tunics, the weavers executed the beautiful, zigzag lines of the herringbone twill. This advanced technique required a more intricate counting of the threads, lifting specific combinations of heddles in a repeating, four-step sequence that shifted the intersection of the yarn one step to the right, then later reversing it to the left. The motion was a slow, deliberate dance of the hands and wooden rods. As the shuttles glided through these complex configurations, the fabric revealed a subtle, undulating pattern that resembled the skeleton of a fish or the structure of a frosted leaf, a geometric harmony that gave the dense wool an incredible natural elasticity and depth. The benefit of these patterns extended far beyond their visual beauty. The diagonal ridges of the herringbone twill created microscopic pockets within the fabric that trapped the body's natural heat far more effectively than any flat weave could manage. It was an ancient engineering marvel introduced quietly by the Queen's master craftsman, showing the local women that structural complexity was the key to true thermal insulation. The weavers took an immense, silent pride in watching these intricate textures emerge from their hands, counting the steps under their breath in a low, melodic murmur that blended with the steady, comforting clatter of the wooden shuttles. As the dusk settled over the castle, bringing a deep indigo light to the narrow windows, the weavers remained anchored in their geometric focus. Every inch of cloth added to the rollers was a flawless combination of vertical warp and horizontal weft, bound together so tightly that not even the sharpest winter draft could penetrate its surface. The chaotic, unpredictable elements of the wild outdoor world were being systematically mastered within these stone walls, reduced to a peaceful, predictable logic of numbers and threads that promised an enduring safety to everyone who would wear it. Deep within the secluded monastery workshops, where the thick limestone walls stood completely impervious to the roaring winter blizzards outside, the art of the loom achieved its most serene expression. In these sacred spaces, the world was reduced to a few essential elements: stone, wood, fibre, and flame. As the early winter darkness claimed the sky, tall beeswax candles were lit in the wrought iron holders along the walls, their steady, golden flames casting long, soft shadows across the high-vaulted ceilings. The air inside was warm, thick, with the comforting rustic perfume of melting wax, fresh tallow soap used to clean the wood, and the rich, protective oils of raw wool warming near the hearth. In this sheltered environment, the usual noise and friction of the outside world vanished entirely, replaced by a profound rhythmic stillness. The only sound that filled the great stone hall was the beautiful, continuous cadence of the weaving process itself, the low, musical sigh of the heddles shifting, the smooth slide of the polished plumwood shuttles, and the deep, solid thud of the wooden beams packing the threads tight. It was a sound that had become the heartbeat of the monastery, a steady, unhurried pulse that seemed to slow the passage of time, wrapping the artisans in a cocoon of absolute concentration and peace. The weavers moved before their tall frames with a calm, automatic precision that came from months of shared labour. Lit by the warm glow of the candles, their figures appeared like ancient painted icons, their faces relaxed and free from the anxieties that usually characterized the winter months. There was no shouting, no hurried commands. A simple nod of the head or a gentle hand gesture was all that was needed to signal the replenishment of a yarn basket or the adjustment of a clay weight. The sacred silence of the cloisters had infused itself into the craft, elevating the repetitive manual work into a form of quiet meditation that nourished the spirit as much as it clothed the body. Every element of the room was designed to support this intense focus. The stone floors were swept clean of all dust, preventing any stray particles from settling into the pristine white linen warps, while the high windows kept the air circulating gently so the smoke from the candles never clouded the eyes. In the corners of the room, baskets of dried lavender and mint were tucked beneath the stacks of finished cloth, releasing a faint, refreshing sweetness whenever a bolt was moved. It was a space completely insulated from chaos, a true sanctuary where the chaotic forces of nature were mastered and reshaped into lasting harmony. As the midnight hour approached, the bells of the monastery chapel rang out in the frozen night, their deep bronze tones softening as they passed through the thick walls of the weaving room. The artisans did not startle or break their rhythm. They simply allowed the music of the bells to blend into the steady clacking of their shuttles. They stood anchored at their stations, surrounded by the physical evidence of their patience, knowing that within this candlelit hall, they were creating more than just blankets and tunics. They were preserving the light of civilization, weaving a dense, beautiful fabric of security that would endure long after the winter snows had melted away. As bolt after bolt of finished textile accumulated in the grand storage alcoves of the palace, the very air within the royal quarters began to carry a new, deeply comforting sensory signature. The harsh, acrid smell of burning wet pine and the damp, musty odour of poorly cured skins that had historically dominated the winter months were systematically replaced by the clean, wholesome aroma of progress. Walking through the stone corridors of Veszprém, one was greeted by a rich and multi-layered perfume, an olfactive tapestry where the crisp, herbaceous scent of newly woven linen blended seamlessly with the warm, rich musk of freshly washed sheep's wool. This unique fragrance was anchored by the natural additives used to preserve the cloth. In the deep wooden chests and stone niches where the fabrics were stacked, the attendants placed ample bundles of dried lavender, meadowsweet and wild mint harvested from the summer fields. As the heavy, dense layers of herringbone wool and fine tabby linen settled onto the shelves, their weight gently pressed against these dried herbs, releasing a faint, refreshing sweetness that drifted through the hallways. It was an aroma that signaled security and abundance, an immediate sensory reassurance to anyone who entered that the castle was fully prepared to shelter its inhabitants through the darkest seasons. The processed linen possessed a scent that was uniquely its own, a clean, starchy freshness that evoked images of sun-drenched river meadows and clear flowing water. Each strand had been washed, boiled with wood ash, and dried in the open air multiple times until it achieved a pristine silver-white purity. When the heavy rolls were unrolled across the inspection tables under Queen Gisela's watchful eye, the movement created a soft draft, scattering this crisp, summer-like fragrance into the winter-chilled rooms. It was a tangible proof of cleanliness and meticulous care, a sharp contrast to the rough, unwashed garments of old. Complementing this lightness was the solid, grounding presence of the wool, because the weavers left a precisely calculated amount of natural lanolin within the fibers to maintain their water-resistant qualities. The heavy winter blankets and tunics retained a deep, comforting warmth in their scent. It smelled of quiet hillsides, of sheltered valleys, and of the protective hearth fires near which the fleece had been sorted and carded. This rich, oily essence gave the textile workshops a profoundly rustic yet orderly atmosphere, making the large stone rooms feel like true sanctuaries of human ingenuity and maternal care. As evening fell, wrapping the citadel in a quiet mantle of starlight and frost, the comforting scents of the textile stores remained suspended in the warm indoor air. The servants and guards who walked the dark corridors breathed in the sweet lavender and the clean linen, their minds filled with a quiet sense of peace and stability. The castle was no longer just a stone fortress built for war. It had become a storehouse of life, fragrant treasury of warmth and dignity where the natural elements of the earth had been collected, refined and woven into an enduring shield against the harshness of the medieval world. Through the long, rhythmic afternoons in the weaving halls, Queen Gisela remained a constant, comforting presence, moving among the artisans with a quiet and observant grace. She did not ride through her workshops on a high horse or dictate commands from a remote throne. Instead, she walked on foot, her soft leather slippers making no sound upon the smooth limestone flagstones. Dressed in a simple, elegant gown of unmarred white linen that she had spun with her own hands, she blended seamlessly into the industrious landscape. Her presence brought not an air of tense anxiety, but a deep stabilizing sense of shared purpose. As she moved down the narrow aisles between the tall upright frames, her eyes swept over the work with a practiced technical expertise. She would pause behind a young girl working her first herringbone pattern, watching the hesitant movement of her fingers as she selected the heddle rods. Rather than offering harsh correction, the queen would kneel beside her on the straw mat, her hands warm and gentle as she guided the girl's wrists, demonstrating the precise, effortless swing needed to pass the plumwood shuttle without snagging the warp. Her touch was reassuring, a silent communication of confidence that instantly smoothed the stuttering rhythm of the loom. With the master weavers, Gisela shared a mutual, silent understanding that required very few words. She would stop before their massive frames, reaching out to run her long, slender fingertips across the newly woven fabric. She tested the density of the weave, checking for absolute consistency in the beat of the comb and ensuring that the tension of the clay weights remained perfectly balanced. If she found a section that was flawlessly executed, she would look up into the tired eyes of the artisan and offer a slow, genuine smile, a simple nod of approval that carried more weight than a purse of silver coins, filling the weaver with a profound sense of pride and dignity. The air around her always carried the faint, sweet scent of rosewater and dried clover, a refreshing contrast to the heavy, oily smell of the raw lanolin and damp flax that filled the workshop. Her quiet supervision transformed the cavernous stone hall into an integrated community, where every individual felt their contribution was seen, valued, and essential to the survival of the realm. She took a genuine interest in the well-being of the women, often pausing to adjust a wool shawl over the shoulders of an elderly spinner, or ensuring that the younger apprentices had sufficient oil for their lamps as the winter dusk closed in. By the time the stars began to needle through the high-arched windows, the queen would take her place at the head of the central aisle, looking out over the sea of moving frames. The steady, soothing chorus of the clacking wood and shifting threads continued under her watchful gaze, a magnificent monument of order and peace that she had systematically cultivated from the raw soil of her new home. As she turned to leave the room, stepping back into the quiet corridors of the palace, the weavers felt the lingering warmth of her presence, their shuttles moving with a renewed, steady confidence that promised to hold the winter at bay. The culmination of many weeks of silent, unwavering focus arrived on a crisp midwinter morning, when the first monumental bolt of heavy woolen cloth was finally deemed complete. The upper cloth beam of the central loom was entirely laden with a dense, magnificent layer of herringbone twill, its deep madder red and warm ochre patterns standing out in brilliant, uniform precision. A quiet expectation settled over the weaving hall as the master artisans gathered around the frame, their shuttles held still in their laps. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the familiar, comforting aromas of dried mint, fresh beeswax, and the rich, protective oils of the wool. With a slow, deliberate movement, the master carpenter stepped forward, carrying a pair of finely forged iron shears that caught the morning light. The tension of the loom was released gently, the heavy clay weights resting on the floorboards with a soft, final thunk. Then, with a clean, rhythmic slicing sound that echoed off the high limestone walls, the warp threads were cut from the frame. As the tension vanished, the fabric relaxed, its natural elasticity causing the herringbone patterns to deepen and soften, transforming the tightly wound layers into a voluminous, breathing mass of protective warmth. The long fabric was carried reverently over to a wide oak inspection table at the center of the hall, where it was unrolled across the dark wood for its final review. Queen Gisela stood at the head of the table, her hands resting quietly upon the edge as the cloth unfolded before her like a great river of color. Together with the elders, she ran her open palms across the vast expanse of the textile. The surface was incredibly dense, yet possessed a smooth, luxurious pliancy that felt wonderfully soothing under the fingertips. There were no dropped threads, no uneven lines, and no gaps between the weft. It was a perfect, unbroken shield of insulation. As the cloth was carefully measured, a profound sense of peace and relief settled over the gathered crowd. This single bolt contained enough fabric to clothe dozens of the most vulnerable children and elders in the surrounding settlements, a material proof that their winter isolation was no longer an absolute vulnerability. The women who had spent long hours spinning the flax and throwing the shuttles looked at the finished work with tears of quiet pride in their eyes, seeing the tangible manifestation of their collective patience and skill resting upon the dark oak boards. With gentle, coordinated movements, the assistants began folding the massive cloth into a neat rectangular bundle. They smoothed each layer as it was placed down, tucking dried lavender leaves between the folds to preserve its freshness during transit. When completed, the bolt was tied securely with thick linen cords and lifted into a deep cedarwood chest lined with clean sheepskins. It was a moment of quiet triumph, a physical testament to the fact that the wilderness had been mastered not by fire, but by the quiet, civilized logic of the thread, establishing an enduring treasury of comfort that would guard the young kingdom for generations to come. Before the deep midwinter blizzards could completely close the mountain passes and bury the lowland tracks under impassable drifts, the palace gates of Veszprém swung open to release the first heavy supply wagons. These long wooden carts, drawn by sturdy oxen whose breath rose into the freezing morning air in thick, pale plumes, were laden not with iron spears or tax chests, but with deep cedar crates packed full of the newly woven textiles. The air was bitingly cold, clear as crystal, and filled with the clean, sharp scent of fresh snow. Yet, as the heavy linen tarpaulins were secured over the cargo, a faint, sweet aroma of dried lavender and rich lanolin escaped into the courtyard, carrying the essence of the warm workshops into the frosty air. The distribution of the cloth was organized with a meticulous maternal care that reached into the furthest, most isolated corners of the plains. Queen Gisela's trusted emissaries, men chosen for their gentle character and deep respect for the peasantry, guided the slow-moving caravans down from the rocky citadel into the valleys. They moved with an unhurried, steady pace, their wooden wheels crunching softly against the frozen crust of the earth. As they approached each scattered hamlet of wattle and daub huts, the defensive anxiety that usually met travellers dissolved into a quiet, profound sense of relief, as the villagers recognized the royal crest of the Queen's weavers. In the centre of the snowy settlements, under the grey winter sky, the crates were unlatched with slow, deliberate movements. The village elders and young mothers gathered in a quiet circle, their hands tucked inside their frayed garments, their faces illuminated by a sudden warmth as the heavy, madder red and ochre herringbone blankets were lifted from the wood. There was no chaotic clamour or greedy reaching. The distribution was a calm, reverent ceremony. The emissaries laid the thick, dense fabrics directly into the open palms of the people, ensuring that the households with the youngest children and the most fragile elders received the deepest, most insulated layers first. As the heavy woolen tunics and soft linen undershirts were slipped over shivering shoulders, a visible change swept across the community. The fabric felt instantly soothing against skin that had been chapped by the raw north wind, its tight weave creating an immediate barrier that trapped the body's natural heat and repelled the penetrating dampness of the snow. Children, wrapped like small, colourful cocoons in the vibrant red cloths, stopped their trembling, their eyes reflecting the soft twilight as they looked down at the smooth patterns under their fingertips. For the first time in memory, the winter had met an adversary that it could not pierce. By the time the evening stars began to crystallize in the deep indigo vault of the sky, the wagons were empty, and the caravans turned slowly back toward Veszprém. Behind them, in the dim interiors of the peasant huts, the hearth fires burned with a new, peaceful clarity. The people sat wrapped in their protective garments, listening to the wind howl harmlessly against the thatch, their minds filled with a profound sense of security and gratitude. The young kingdom had stretched out its hands through the vision of its queen, wrapping its people in a literal and spiritual mantle of warmth that promised to sustain them through the longest nights of the year. With the arrival of the new textiles, the physical landscape of the rural settlements underwent a profound and beautiful transformation. The bleak, uniform greyness that had historically defined the winter months, where families remained hidden away in dark, smoky interiors, gave way to a vibrant renewal of communal life. As the morning sun broke over the frozen hills, casting a pale, crystalline light across the snowdrifts, the village squares came alive with colour. Children emerged from the thatch-roofed cottages wrapped securely in dense, madder-red cloaks, while the elders sat on low wooden benches outside their doors, their shoulders draped in heavy herringbone shawls of warm ochre and deep forest brown. The air remained bitingly cold, and the breath of the people still rose into the stillness in thick, pale plumes of mist, but the pervasive shivering that had once accompanied the frost was entirely gone. The tight, uniform weave of Queen Gisela's fabrics acted as a flawless shield, trapping the natural warmth of the body while keeping the raw, humid drafts from penetrating to the skin. Women walked down to the frozen wells with a steady, confident grace, their movements unrestricted by the rigid, poorly cured skins of the past, their new linen undershirts offering a soft, smooth layer of comfort that felt wonderfully soothing against their hard-working frames. This physical comfort brought about a noticeable shift in the social spirit of the hamlets. No longer forced to huddle in absolute isolation around the central fire pits, neighbours gathered in the open air, leaning against the sturdy timber fences to converse in low, relaxed tones. The soft, rhythmic crunch of leather boots on the hard-packed snow accompanied the cheerful murmur of children playing along the pathways, their small hands protected by thick wool mittens. The winter was no longer a period of dread and passive survival. It had become a season of peaceful endurance, anchored by the tangible security of human craftsmanship. Even the simple interiors of the huts looked different. The beds of dry straw and ferns were now covered with wide, heavy wool blankets that retained the clean, refreshing aroma of the palace workshops, a comforting blend of dried lavender, mint, and natural sheep's oil. When the night wind swept down from the northern peaks, rattling the wooden shutters, the families lay down to rest with an unprecedented sense of peace. They felt the heavy, reassuring weight of the blankets pressing down on them, an absolute barrier between their sleep and the immense, freezing void of the medieval night. As the twilight deepened, wrapping the villages in a calm mantle of deep blue and starlight, the colourful garments faded softly into the evening shadows. The old people looked out at the vast open plains with a quiet serenity, knowing that their children were guarded against the elements as never before. The face of the kingdom was changing, shedding its wild, vulnerable exterior to reveal a society that was structured, cared for, and deeply grounded. Through the quiet distribution of a single craft, a new tapestry of village life had been woven, where winter was no longer an enemy, but a time of quiet rest and protected harmony. As the winter weeks melted into the gentle thaws of late February, the inspiring story of Veszprém's thriving workshops rippled outward across the young kingdom like ripples on a calm lake. In distant river valleys, along the wooded fringes of the northern hills, and across the vast eastern steppes, leaders and village elders listened with deep fascination to travelling merchants who spoke of the Queen's wonderful initiative. They heard tales of a great hall where raw, wild earth was systematically converted into soft, vibrant armour against the frost, and where peasant women walked with smooth fingertips and an unprecedented sense of personal dignity. This exciting news ignited a quiet desire for self-sufficiency across the entire territory. No longer content to remain passive observers of their own harsh environment, neighbouring settlements began selecting their brightest, most patient young women to journey to the royal citadel. These small delegations travelled slowly along the damp, muddy tracks of early spring, bringing with them unique regional gifts, bundles of dark hemp from the muddy marshes, skeins of fine wool from hill sheep, and small pottery jars of rare local seed varieties. They arrived at the palace gates not as suppliants seeking charity, but as eager apprentices seeking the enduring wealth of practical knowledge. Queen Gisela welcomed these foreign representatives with an open heart and a serene grace that immediately dissolved their initial anxieties. She did not hoard the technical secrets of her craft within the capital. Instead, she viewed her workshops as a grand academy for the entire nation. Under her thoughtful direction, the vast weaving halls were expanded, and additional rows of heavy upright pine frames were constructed by the castle carpenters to accommodate the influx of new students. The newcomers were gently integrated into the existing circles of spinners and dyers, creating a beautiful, diverse community of shared learning that filled the rooms with a warm murmur of voices. The atmosphere in the workshops became richer and more varied as different cultural traditions began to converse through the silent language of the hands. Master weavers from Bavaria stood side by side with young girls from the eastern plains, guiding their wrists through the complex geometries of the herringbone twill and demonstrating how to calculate the tension of the heavy clay weights. The air was constantly alive with the comforting scents of fresh wood shavings, boiled herbs, and the rich lanolin of raw fleece, creating a sensory environment that felt profoundly stable, creative, and protective. By the time the early spring wildflowers began to splash colour across the limestone meadows of Veszprém, the first generation of visiting apprentices had completed their initial training. They prepared to return to their distant homes, their wagons loaded not just with sample bolts of madder red and ochre cloth, but with newly crafted plumwood shuttles, carved bone spindle walls, and complete blueprints for constructing their own domestic looms. They carried back with them the spark of an expansive, peaceful industry, ready to seed identical sanctuaries of order and warmth across every corner of the realm, ensuring that the entire nation would soon beat to the same soothing, industrious cadence. The great wheel of the year turned slowly over the Pannonian basin as the stern, white landscapes of winter dissolved into the tender, pale greens of a magnificent spring. Along the banks of the wide Danube, the thick plates of river ice fractured with deep, resonant booms that echoed off the hills, melting away into a rushing torrent of cold, clear water. The north wind lost its biting edge, transforming into a gentle, humid breeze that carried the rich, fertile scent of damp earth, awakening roots, and the first wild violets blooming in the forest clearings. The immense sky widened, its heavy grey clouds scattering to reveal an endless expanse of brilliant soft blue that breathed a quiet peace over the entire kingdom. Within the stone sanctuaries of Queen Gisela's workshops, this shifting of seasons brought no disruption to the steady, industrious focus that had taken root during the dark months. The weavers did not abandon their stations at the first sign of warmth. Instead, the changing weather simply altered the sensory landscape of their labour. The heavy wooden shutters of the tall, arched windows were thrown wide for the first time in months, allowing the fresh, spring air to sweep through the long halls. The cool breeze carried the sweet perfume of damp meadows and blossoming orchards inside, where it blended beautifully with the familiar comforting aromas of processed flax, smoothed pine timber, and the rich musk of raw fleece. The sunlight that streamed into the workshops was now bright and golden, illuminating the long rows of upright looms with a brilliant clarity. The artisans no longer needed the flickering, smoky light of tallow lamps or beeswax candles. The natural day provided a perfect, unshadowed view of their frames. Millions of tiny golden dust motes danced lazily in the bright beams, rising and falling in harmony with the steady, soothing symphony of the weaving process. The soft, musical sigh of the heddles shifting, the smooth slide of the plumwood shuttles, and the deep, grounding thud of the wooden combs packing the threads tight. With the arrival of the sun, the focus of the workshops shifted naturally toward lighter, more delicate materials. The heavy, dense herringbone wools that had guarded the people against the winter frost were neatly folded away into deep cedar chests, and the looms were redressed with fine, silver-grey warp threads of pure linen. The fingers of the spinners moved with a quick, delicate pliancy, drawing out strands of fibre so thin they seemed almost invisible in the bright morning light. The resulting fabric was light, smooth, and remarkably breathable, designed to offer comfort and protection during the warm, humid summer months that lay ahead. As the afternoon sun matured, casting long, geometric shadows across the pristine flagstones, a profound sense of continuity settled over the court. The workshops had transcended their original purpose as an emergency refuge from the winter. They had become a permanent part of the kingdom's identity, a steady anchor that operated in perfect harmony with the natural cycles of the earth. The weavers stood at their frames, their faces relaxed and illuminated by the golden spring twilight, their hands moving with an effortless, timeless grace that promised to sustain the structure, warmth, and dignity of their people through every season yet to come. As the spring waters of the Danube normalized into a wide, shimmering highway of silver, the first great merchant vessels from the distant east began to drop their heavy iron anchors at the trading ports along the riverbanks. These massive wooden ships, their hulls weathered by long journeys through distant seas and ancient riverways, brought to the young Hungarian kingdom the exotic treasures of remote civilizations. The bustling river docks were filled with a vibrant cosmopolitan energy, where the fresh, watery scent of the river blended with the rich, unfamiliar aromas of rare spices, dried citrus fruits, and refined resins packed deep within the ship holds. Among these luxury goods, none caught the attention of the royal court quite like the precious bundles of raw silk threads. Carried along the ancient overland trade routes by disciplined caravans before being loaded onto the Danube boats, these rare fibres were unlike anything the local artisans had ever encountered. Packed carefully within oiled leather pouches to shield them from the salt and dampness, the silk skeins were incredibly light, possessing a natural, pearlescent shimmer that seemed to capture and hold the sunlight within its very structure. The colour palette was breathtaking. Deep, lustrous indigos, brilliant imperial purples, and shimmering golds that looked like spun starlight. When these precious materials were brought up to the quiet stone chambers of Vesprem, Queen Gisela examined them with a deep, reverent appreciation. She recognized that these exquisite threads held the potential to elevate her textile initiatives from utilitarian garments to high ceremonial art. Rather than hoarding the silk for exclusive personal adornment, she chose to integrate it gently into her finest ongoing projects. Under her thoughtful supervision, the master weavers began introducing thin, shimmering borders of silk into the edges of heavy linen altar cloths and majestic royal mantles. creating a beautiful juxtaposition between the rustic strength of local fibers and the refined elegance of the East. The handling of the silk required a delicate precision that tested the limits of the weaver's newly acquired skills. The thread was incredibly smooth, lacking the natural grip of raw wool or the crisp structure of flax, meaning it could easily slip and unravel if not managed with absolute patience. The artisans sat before their tall, upright frames in complete silence, their fingers moving with a slow, feather-light sensitivity as they integrated the glistening silk strands into the warp. The air in the ceremonial workshop was thick with a quiet concentration, sweet with the scent of rosewater used to mist the delicate materials to prevent any static. As the late afternoon sun cast long amber beams through the high narrow windows, the finished sections of the ceremonial cloths began to glow with a magical multi-layered depth. The local wool and linen provided a solid protective foundation, while the woven silk details caught the light with every movement, creating a subtle, shimmering play of colors that looked deeply sophisticated. The integration of these rare global threads stood as a beautiful physical manifestation of the kingdom's growth, a young society that was firmly rooted in its own soil, yet open to receiving and harmonizing the finest gifts of the wider world. If you find a sense of deep comfort and peace in these slow journeys through the woven tapestries of our shared past, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this narrative, helping others discover a quiet sanctuary of historical reflection before sleep. The high, quiet sanctuary of the palace's inner atelier was cleared for a project of unprecedented significance. Under the close, personal direction of Queen Gisela, the master carpenters erected a massive, specialized upright loom, carved from the finest heartwood of ancient oaks that had been seasoned for over a decade. This frame was designed to bear an extraordinary structural tension, for it was destined to birth a true masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, a grand coronation mantle that would serve as the ultimate visual symbol of the young kingdom's unified identity and spiritual devotion. The materials selected for this grand undertaking represented the absolute pinnacle of the textile arts. The background warp was composed of an incredibly dense, multi-layered wool twill, dyed a deep, majestic indigo that resembled the velvety expanse of the night sky over the Pannonian plains. To complement this profound colour, the weavers prepared fine skeins of pure gold thread, created by meticulously wrapping ultra-thin ribbons of beaten gold around a central core of fine silk. In the quiet morning light that streamed through the tall, arched windows, these materials lay arranged in neat willow baskets, filling the room with a rich, unique aroma of natural oils, organic dye barks, and the subtle, clean metallic scent of the precious threads. The initiation of the weave was a slow, reverent ceremony. The most experienced weavers in the realm stood before the towering frame, their expressions calm and deeply focused. Unlike the utilitarian fabrics made for the village settlements, every single throw of the plumwood shuttle across this warp required a complex mathematical calculation. The artisans had to meticulously hand-count individual threads, floating the gold yarn over the dark indigo background to create intricate, raised geometric borders and symbolic constellations that seemed to materialize out of the darkness of the cloth. The sound within the atelier was unique, a softer and more delicate cadence than the heavy, booming rhythm of the general workshops. The fine gold and silk threads made a gentle, metallic whisper as they glided between the indigo warp strands, a sound like a soft spring breeze moving through a field of dry wheat. Each line of weft was pressed upward with a specialized comb made of polished ivory which met the wood with a faint, muted tap that echoed softly off the white limestone walls. This meticulous pacing ensured that not a single strand of gold was twisted or uneven, preserving an absolute mirror-like consistency across the entire width of the vestment. As the weeks turned into months, a few feet of the magnificent mantle began to reveal itself at the top of the frame. The contrast between the deep matte indigo wool and the brilliant shimmering gold thread was mesmerizing, capturing the light with a fluid, liquid-like quality whenever the afternoon sun shifted across the room. Queen Gisela spent her evenings sitting quietly near the loom, her fingers gently checking the thickness of the edge, her mind filled with a profound peace. This cloth was more than a garment. It was an enduring document of patience, a physical manifestation of a culture that had learned to weave its wild, disparate elements into a singular tapestry of lasting beauty, majesty, and order. As the heavy indigo and gold backing of the royal mantle was slowly completed and rolled from the great oak frame, it was brought into the Queen's private solar for the most delicate stage of its creation. Here, where the thick limestone walls kept the spring afternoon remarkably quiet, long trestle tables were set up beneath the tallest south-facing windows. The light that poured into the room was clear and constant, illuminating the deep blue fabric with an unshadowed brilliance. Queen Gisela, surrounded by her noble ladies and the most gifted needlewomen of the realm, sat in a wide circle, her posture relaxed, her lap filled with the weight of the dense, soft textile. The air in the private chamber was wonderfully peaceful, carrying a clean, refined aroma that set it apart from the busier workshops. It smelled of fine linen dressings, fresh rosewater used to cool the fingers, and the subtle, earthy sweetness of beeswax discs through which the embroidery threads were drawn to give them strength and smoothness. In shallow willow trays resting between the chairs lay hundreds of small bone needles and an abundance of fine silk threads, vibrant crimsons, rich forest greens, pale sky blues, and shimmering golds, all waiting to be introduced into the grand indigo canvas. The work was an exercise in absolute patience and microscopic detail. Using thin bone needles, the Queen and her ladies began embroidering intricate, historical and sacred scenes directly onto the surface of the wool. Their fingers moved with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, pulling the coloured silks through the dense backing with a soft, whisper-like sound that filled the silent room. They stitched delicate figures of apostles, sweeping wings of angels, and intricate geometric borders that mirrored the wild wildflowers blooming in the meadows below the castle walls. Every stitch was placed with a deliberate calculation, requiring a calmness of spirit that turned the labour into a form of silent devotion. There was no rush within these stone walls. The passage of time was marked only by the slow movement of the sunbeams across the flagstones and the steady, gentle rise and fall of the needles. Gisela would occasionally lean across to assist a younger companion, showing her how to anchor a gold thread with an invisible stitch of silk, or how to shade the fold of a gown to give it depth and movement. Her voice was always low and encouraging, keeping the atmosphere inside the solar as steady and serene as the ancient hills visible through the stone arches. By the time the afternoon began to fade into a soft amber twilight, a magnificent array of figures had begun to take life upon the mantle. The brilliant silk threads caught the changing light, their colours glowing with a multi-layered richness against the dark indigo background. The women paused, resting their hands upon the fabric, looking at the progress of their shared dedication with a quiet sense of peace. Inside this quiet sanctuary, through the gentle, repetitive motion of the needle, a lasting monument of their culture's faith, patience, and artistry was being slowly and beautifully realized, stitch by single stitch. When the deep midnight hours claimed the citadel, wrapping the stone towers of Veszprém in a vast starlit silence, the activity inside the Queen's private solar did not entirely cease. Instead, the workshop shifted into its most intimate and reflective state. A single wide iron ring of thick beeswax candles was lowered from the centre of the vaulted ceiling, its cluster of small golden flames burning with an absolute steadiness in the draught-free room. The soft light created a warm, protective circle of illumination, casting long, gentle shadows against the smooth limestone walls and transforming the chamber into a quiet harbour of nocturnal creativity. The air in the room was warm and profoundly comforting, heavy with the sweet, rich perfume of melting honey wax, the crisp starch of linen frame covers, and the faint, woody aroma of the seasoned oak tables. Sitting close to the centre of the light, Queen Gisela and her two most trusted master embroiderers continued their work upon the royal vestments. At this hour, all conversation had dissolved into the shadows. There was no need for spoken words. The three women moved with a synchronized, automatic precision, their minds perfectly attuned to the silent geometry of the needle and the dense indigo wool resting across their knees. The only sound that broke the absolute stillness of the night was the rhythmic, soft friction of the embroidery itself. a gentle, dual-toned cadence where the bone needle made a faint, clean click as it pierced the fabric, followed by the long, smooth whisper of the silk thread being drawn through the tight weave. It was a beautiful, hypnotic music that seemed to harmonize with the slow, deep breathing of the palace. The repetition of the gesture, up through the dark wool, drawing the gold thread taut, down into the indigo background, acted as a soothing anchor, clearing the mind of all worldly anxieties and replacing them with a profound, orderly calm. Under the soft glow of the candles, the gold and silver threads on the mantle took on a deeper, more mysterious brilliance. The tiny hand-placed stitches caught the flickering amber light, making the embroidered figures of saints and ancient kings appear to move and breathe within their glittering frames. Gisela worked on the central panel, her slender fingers guiding a thread of pure crimson silk to form the delicate petals of a symbolic rose. Her touch was feather-light, completely free of haste or tension. She knew that the stillness of the midnight hour was a precious resource, allowing for a level of artistic focus that the busy daytime could never afford. As the distant watchmen called out the turning of the guard from the high ramparts, their voices softening as they passed through the thick stone window frames, the queen paused for a slow, meditative breath. She looked down at the vast expanse of the vestment, feeling the weight of the dense protective cloth against her lap. In the silence of the candlelit solar, surrounded by the beautiful fruits of their shared patience, she felt a deep sense of security. The chaotic darkness of the medieval world was held completely at bay, neutralized by the quiet, civilized discipline of a few women working together in the night, preserving the soul of their people through the eternal logic of the thread. On a glorious morning in late May, as the first bright beams of the spring sun climbed over the eastern peaks of the Bacony Hills, the grand coronation mantle was finally declared complete. The final gold thread had been anchored, the last knot tucked invisibly away, and the linen framing sheets removed from the oak tables. A deep, reverent silence filled the queen's solar as the master embroiderers stepped back, their hands resting loosely at their sides. The cool morning air, drifting through the open stone archways, carried the sweet, fresh scent of blooming orchards and dew-kissed meadows, blending beautifully with the lingering, rich aroma of beeswax and fine wool that had come to define the room. With slow, synchronized movements, 4 senior attendants lifted the massive vestment from the dark oak boards, carrying it out into the center of the high-vaulted reception hall, where the morning light poured directly through the tallest windows. As they held the mantle aloft, the fabric caught the full brilliance of the sun, revealing a breathtaking masterpiece that seemed to vibrate with a life of its own. The contrast was magnificent. The deep, rich indigo wool backing possessed a matte, velvety texture that absorbed the light like the deepest midnight sky, while the thousands of hand-placed gold and silver threads caught the beams, reflecting a fluid, liquid-like shimmer that danced across the stone walls. The intricate details of the embroidery were a marvel of medieval artistry. Across the vast blue expanse, delicate figures of apostles, martyrs and angels stood arranged in perfect mathematical rows, their expressions serene and full of dignity. The crimson, sky blue and forest green silk threads used to shade their garments had been blended with such microscopic precision that the figures appeared three-dimensional, casting soft, internal glows against the dark background. Encircling the entire edge of the mantle was a heavy geometric border of gold twill, an unbroken frame of discipline that bound the entire narrative together in an eternal circle of order and beauty. Queen Gisela stood a few paces back, her arms folded gently across her linen gown, her face illuminated by the brilliant reflections from the cloth. She ran her eyes over the vast expanse of the textile, tracing the lines she had stitched during the quiet midnight hours. There was no vanity in her gaze, only a profound, stabilizing sense of peace. This mantle was no longer just a collection of global silk and local wool. It had become a living document of her people's journey, a physical manifestation of a culture that had successfully learned to master the wild, chaotic elements of their environment and weave them into a lasting monument of civilization. As the noon sun reached its zenith, filling the hall with an unshadowed golden clarity, the attendants carefully lowered the masterpiece onto a wide cushion of white linen. The fabric settled with a soft, heavy sigh, its dense weave folding into deep, luxurious ridges that continued to shimmer in the light. The artisans who had spent months spinning the flax, tending the dye vats, and guiding the bone needles stood in a quiet circle, their eyes filled with a quiet pride. In the heart of the Vesprem citadel, a timeless treasure had been born, a sacred shield of majesty and grace that would wrap the young kingdom in dignity for centuries to come. On the morning following its completion, the grand mantle was carried in solemn quiet procession across the sunlit courtyard and into the cool limestone interior of the castle chapel. The air inside the sacred space was completely still, a sanctuary of absolute shadow and light where the chaotic murmurs of the outside world instantly dissolved. High, narrow windows sliced the darkness into thick, slanting beams of golden sunlight, illuminating millions of tiny dust motes drifting lazily toward the vaulted ceiling. The atmosphere was rich and deeply comforting, thick with the ancient resinous perfume of burning frankincense, the sweet musk of melting beeswax candles, and the clean, starchy freshness of the linen sheets upon which the mantle rested. The vestment was laid reverently across the main stone altar, a massive block of pale Hungarian marble that had been polished until it gleamed like ice. In this dim, sacred light, the deep indigo wool backing appeared almost black, a silent expanse of midnight sky over which the thousands of gold and silver threads shimmered with a soft, internal fire. The embroidered figures of the saints and angels seemed to step forward from the cloth, their delicate silk faces catching the flickering amber glow from the tall altar candles that stood like silent sentinels around the marble slab. The blessing ceremony was conducted with an unhurried, meditative simplicity. The royal chaplain, dressed in vestments of plain white wool, stepped before the altar, his movements slow and deliberate. He raised a heavy bronze censer, swinging it in a gentle, rhythmic arc over the outstretched mantle. Thick, fragrant plumes of white smoke billowed from the metal filigree, drifting lazily down into the deep, luxurious folds of the indigo fabric. The sweet, woody aroma of the incense infused itself into the fibers, marrying perfectly with the natural scent of the raw wool and the dried lavender that had preserved the cloth during its long months of creation. Queen Gisela knelt quietly upon the stone floorboards at the front of the nave, her head bowed and her hands resting loosely in her lap. Beside her stood the master weavers and the needlewomen who had shared in the long nocturnal labour of the atelier. There were no loud hymns or triumphant fanfares. The only sound was the low melodic murmur of the chaplain's Latin prayers, a steady cadence that rolled off the limestone arches like the soothing patter of evening rain. The prayer was a dedication of patience, a formal recognition that the physical labour of human hands had been elevated into an enduring instrument of spiritual peace and national unity. As the final amen echoed softly into the high rafters, the chaplain dipped a sprig of wild hyssop into a silver bowl of spring water, scattering a fine mist of droplets across the surface of the mantle. The tiny beads of water sat like morning dew upon the shimmering gold threads before sinking quietly into the dense protective weave. The ceremony was complete. The mantle was no longer merely a masterpiece of human craftsmanship. It had been sanctified as a historic shield of grace, a sacred garment that stood ready to invest the young realm with a permanent sense of dignity, order, and quiet majesty. In the great council chamber of Vesprem, where the massive timber tables were usually strewn with iron scale armour, leather maps, and the heavy seals of state, a grand space was cleared to receive the blessed coronation mantle. King Stephen sat at the head of the long hall, his expression grave and worn from the relentless political strains of consolidating a young realm. The room was cool, yet a massive fire of split oak logs burned steadily in the wide stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering orange light across the room and filling the air with the comforting, rustic scent of wood smoke and seasoned timber. Accompanied by a quiet retinue of her master weavers, Queen Gisela stepped into the hall, her movements marked by that familiar serene grace. Together, the attendants lifted the massive indigo and gold vestment, unfolding it across the dark oak table before the king. As the fabric settled onto the wood, it released a gentle draft, scattering the complex and beautiful aroma that had become the signature of the palace workshops, the clean freshness of processed linen, the rich warmth of raw wool lanolin, and the sweet, resinous notes of chapel incense and dried lavender. The king stood up slowly, stepping toward the table, his sharp eyes raking over the vast expanse of the textile. He reached out with hands that were rough, heavily scarred from the friction of iron sword hilts and the coarse leather reins of war horses. As his wide palms pressed into the fabric, a visible change softened his posture. The mantle possessed a remarkable dense weight, a physical thickness that promised an absolute defense against the bitterest winter winds, yet the surface felt incredibly smooth and supple, yielding to his touch with a luxurious, comforting pliancy. Stephen looked closely at the intricate geometry of the gold twill borders and the microscopic perfection of the embroidered silk apostles. As a ruler, his mind instantly grasped the profound strategic reality laid out upon the oak boards. This garment was magnificent, but the industry that created it was a monumental achievement for the state. Gisela had not simply created a beautiful piece of royal regalia. She had systematically transformed raw, wild valleys of flax and unmanaged flocks of hill sheep into a highly organized, self-sufficient network of production that had already protected thousands of his subjects from the winter frost. Looking up from the shimmering gold threads, the king met the calm, steady gaze of his queen. He offered no loud praise or dramatic gestures, but rather a slow, deep nod of profound respect and gratitude, a shared understanding between two architects of a new civilization. He understood that the enduring strength of his kingdom would not be measured solely by the sharpness of its iron spears, but by the quiet, civilized discipline of the loom. In the warm light of the council room, surrounded by the physical evidence of his people's patience, the king felt a deep, systemic sense of security, knowing that the young realm was now wrapped in a mantle of order and majesty that no adversary could pierce. As the bright, unclouded days of early summer settled over the Pannonian basin, a quiet reflection took root within the stone corridors of Veszprém. The textile workshops, initially conceived as an urgent shield against the brutal winter frosts, had subtly and permanently altered the cultural fabric of the young kingdom. The desperate defensive posture of past generations, where human life was spent in a grueling, seasonal battle for mere biological survival, had been systematically replaced by a refined sense of permanence, structure, and artistic expression. The physical indicators of this cultural shift were visible throughout the realm. In the village squares, the crude, unwashed animal pelts of the past had vanished from daily wear, relegated to the hard outdoor labor of clearing forests and digging irrigation ditches. Even the humblest peasant families now walked with a distinct personal dignity, wrapped in clean, durable garments of local linen and uniform tabby wool. This newfound physical comfort brought about a noticeable softening of social relations. The pervasive anxiety that had once driven communities into defensive isolation during the dark months had evaporated, replaced by a confident, cooperative spirit that bound the settlements together. Within the weaving halls themselves, the nature of the work had naturally evolved. Having mastered the absolute precision required for basic thermal insulation, the local artisans began exploring the boundaries of pure aesthetics. Spinners competed gently to see who could draw out the thinnest, most uniform strands of flax, while the dyers experimented with subtle variations of forest bark and wild berries, producing soft, pastel hues of sky blue and pale primrose yellow for the summer tunics. The looms were no longer viewed merely as tools for production. They had become instruments of cultural identity, translating the raw materials of the earth into a sophisticated vocabulary of geometric design. This evolution from survival to sovereignty was anchored by the permanent structure Queen Gisela had established. The vast networks of spinning circles, regional dye houses, and carpentry shops specializing in plumwood shuttles were now self-sustaining entities, operating in perfect harmony with the natural cycles of the agricultural year. The knowledge was being preserved and passed down organically. Elderly master weavers sat on sunlit benches in the courtyard, their smooth, lanolin-softened fingers gently guiding the wrists of young granddaughters, who were just learning to count the threads for their first herringbone borders. As the evening twilight draped the citadel in a warm mantle of amber and indigo, the steady rhythmic chorus of the workshops continued to echo softly off the limestone flagstones. It was a sound that had become synonymous with the peace of the realm, a continuous, comforting pulse that signaled a civilization that had successfully mastered its environment. The young kingdom was no longer a collection of disparate, vulnerable clans wandering the wild plains. Through the quiet, civilized logic of the thread, it had been woven into a unified, resilient nation, standing tall and secure in its own shared dignity. The great wheel of the seasons turned fully at last, bringing the high golden maturity of mid-August to the vast Pannonian plains. Across the rolling hills surrounding the citadel of Vesprem, the immense flax fields that had been planted during the soft thaws of early spring had reached their perfect whispering completion. The pale blue flowers of the spring had long since fallen away, replaced by heavy rounded seed capsules that rattled gently in the warm summer breeze like millions of tiny wood-bone beads. The long, slender stalks had turned from a vibrant emerald to a rich, uniform pale gold, standing tall and dense across the landscape, a brilliant sea of fibre that shimmered under the unclouded sun. The harvest began not with chaotic haste, but with the same calm, deliberate precision that Queen Gisela had infused into every stage of her industry. Early in the morning, while the grass was still cool and wet with heavy beads of crystalline dew, long lines of village families stepped into the fields. They did not use iron scythes to cut the crop, for cutting would sever the precious internal fibres and shorten the length of the thread. Instead, they bent gracefully from the waist, pulling the flax up by its very roots with a smooth, continuous upward motion. The air was thick with a deeply nostalgic rustic perfume, the sweet, starchy scent of drying straw, the warm aroma of sun-baked earth, and the faint, fruity sweetness of the ripe seed pods cracking open. As the stalks were pulled, they were laid down in neat, overlapping rows to dry in the fierce afternoon heat. The workers moved with a synchronized rhythmic ease, their hands, once rough and split from field labor, but now permanently softened and smoothed by months of contact with raw wool lanolin, handling the golden bundles with an innate, respectful sensitivity. There was a profound sense of quiet joy flowing through the fields. The people looked across the sweeping valleys and saw the immense abundance of raw material resting upon the earth, knowing with absolute certainty that their storehouses would be overflowing before the first autumn frost could touch the ground. By mid-afternoon, the dried flax was gathered into heavy, symmetrical sheaves, tied securely with thin bands of twisted straw, and loaded onto the large wooden harvest wagons. As the heavy oxen guided the carts slowly back toward the riverbanks for the retting process, Queen Gisela stood upon the high limestone ramparts of the palace, watching the long golden caravans wind their way through the valley. The great circle of production had closed flawlessly. The fields had yielded their wealth, the workshops stood ready with their polished plumwood shuttles, and the people possessed the quiet, masterly knowledge required to turn this wild harvest into a beautiful shield of permanent warmth and security. As the sun sank below the western peaks, casting an endless amber twilight across the peaceful realm, the steady rhythmic clacking of the looms echoed softly from the palace windows, blending perfectly with the evening songs of the harvesters in the distance. The kingdom was no longer at the mercy of the elements. It had found its pulse, its structure, and its enduring dignity. Wrapped in the tangible security of their own craftsmanship and guided by the serene vision of their queen, the people looked toward the coming winter not with fear, but with a profound, unshakable peace, knowing that they were bound together in an eternal tapestry of civilization that no storm could ever unravel. As the golden heat of August faded into the crisp, translucent air of late September, a familiar shift began to ripple across the high plains of Vesprem. The whispering flax fields, now harvested and reduced to clean, golden sheaves in the storage barns, left the earth bare and dark, ready for its winter rest. The evening skies grew deep and vast, turning a sharp indigo at twilight, while the early morning mist rolled off the Danube in thick, silent waves that clung to the valleys like unspun wool. The north wind, which had slept through the long summer months, woke with a low, collective sigh, scattering the first dry oak leaves across the limestone courtyard of the citadel. Inside the palace weaving halls, this return of the cool air was met not with the frantic, defensive anxiety of previous years, but with a calm, systemic readiness. The heavy wooden shutters were partially closed against the rising drafts, creating a warm, protected interior that felt incredibly secure. The sunlight that filtered through the high-arched windows was now pale and focused, slicing through the immense rooms to illuminate a landscape of absolute order. The weavers stood at their stations before the tall pine frames, their faces relaxed, their hands moving with the effortless, automatic grace of true masters. With the temperature dropping, the focus of the looms shifted naturally back to the heavy, dense structures of winter. The fine, light summer linens were carefully rolled, bound with clean hemp cords, and carried away to the central treasury, while the frames were redressed with massive, deep-dyed warps of madder red and ochre wool. The spinners worked near the great stone hearths, their fingers drawing out thick, voluminous strands of native fleece that were still rich with the protective oils of the autumn shearing. The air inside was thick with a deeply comforting sensory signature, the rustic scent of split pine burning in the hearths, the sweet perfume of dried lavender bundles warming in the corners, and the clean oily musk of the raw wool. Queen Gisela walked the long rows of looms as the dusk began to settle, her white linen gown brushing softly against the flagstones. She paused to watch the rhythmic, mathematical dance of a young apprentice executing a flawless herringbone pattern. The girl's hands, which had once been rough and chapped by the raw earth, were now smooth and nimble, throwing the plumwood shuttle with a confident, musical click that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. There was no hesitation in her movement. She understood the geometry of the thread, knowing that every perfect crossing of warp and weft was a brick in an invisible wall that would hold the coming winter completely at bay. As the first true frost of the season crystallized along the outer ramparts, turning the stone walls a glittering silver under the stars, the steady, soothing chorus of the workshop continued into the night. The thud of the wooden combs packing the threads tight beat like a slow, unhurried heart at the center of the fortress. The kingdom was fully prepared. The storehouses were packed with dense blankets and insulated tunics. The artisans possessed an unbreakable knowledge, and the people were wrapped in a physical and spiritual mantle of security. The cold had returned, but it found a society that was no longer wild or vulnerable. A civilization woven so tightly into its own dignity that no winter storm could ever hope to pierce its core. As the autumn evenings stretched longer, pulling a vast mantle of starlight and chill over the lowland hamlets, a beautiful new domestic rhythm took root within the timber-framed huts of the peasantry. The frantic, exhausting race against the daylight that had once characterized this season was gone. Instead, as the dusk settled, families gathered around their central hearths not out of defensive dread, but to step into a structured, peaceful world of their own making. The roaring fires of seasoned ash logs cast a warm, flickering amber glow across the smooth clay floors, filling the small rooms with a comforting, rustic scent of wood smoke, roasted chestnuts, and the rich, clean musk of warming wool. In these cozy interiors, the women and young girls established small, localized synecurcles that mirrored the grand scale of the Queen's workshops. Sitting on low three-legged stools near the heat, they held their smooth spindle walls carved from dense riverbone or polished plumwood with an easy, practiced familiarity. Their fingers, permanently softened by months of contact with the natural lanolin of the fleece, moved with a hypnotic, fluid sensitivity. With a gentle twist of the wrist, they set the weights spinning, drawing out long, uniform strands of silver-grey flax and rich ochre wool from the distaffs tucked beneath their arms. The sound inside the cottages was incredibly soothing, a delicate, low-toned lullaby that gave the autumn nights a profound sense of order. There was the soft, continuous purr of the wooden spindles dancing across the floorboards, the rhythmic snap of dry twigs feeding the fire, and the low, melodic murmur of the women sharing ancient stories or counting their paces under their breath. Children lay curled on beds of fresh straw nearby, their minds drifting off to sleep to this steady domestic heartbeat, completely insulated from the vast, freezing void of the wilderness outside. Every generation found its place within these small circles of industry. Grandmother weavers, whose eyes could no longer trace the fine threads of the loom, sat closest to the light, using their highly sensitive fingertips to check the consistency of the yarn drawn by the younger girls. If they detected a thick spot or a weak knot, they would offer a gentle, silent correction, guiding the child's hand with an encouraging touch that passed down centuries of practical wisdom. This shared labour transformed the dark, isolated hours of the medieval night into a profound matrix of community and personal dignity. By the midnight hour, when the frost began to needle through the cracks of the wooden shutters, the baskets beside the hearths were overflowing with tight, perfectly wound balls of thread. The families prepared for rest, covering the embers with thick layers of grey ash to preserve the heat until morning. They pulled the heavy herringbone blankets up to their chins, breathing in the faint, clean scent of dried mint and lavender trapped within the fibres. In the quiet darkness of the village, surrounded by the physical fruits of their patience, the people felt completely secure, knowing that their own hands had spun the very fabric of their survival. On a crisp silver-grey morning in late October, the slow rhythmic crunch of heavy wheels announced the arrival of a royal caravan from the citadel. The long wooden wagons, protected by heavy oiled tarpaulins, wound their way down the frosty tracks into the heart of the valley settlements. The air was bitingly cold, carrying the sharp, clean scent of impending snow, but the mood in the village square instantly transformed into one of quiet excitement as the royal emissaries unlatched the deep oak crates. They brought a direct gift from Queen Gisela's central atelier, a shipment of newly forged, iron-toothed wool cards designed to revolutionize the preparation of the raw fibers. Until this moment, the village women had spent long, exhausting hours preparing the sheep's fleece using primitive combs made of dried teasel pods or carved bone pins. It was a slow, stuttering process that often left the long fibres tangled or broken. The new tools, however, were marvels of practical engineering. Each pair consisted of 2 flat paddles of seasoned beechwood, fitted with smooth leather-backed handles and set with hundreds of tiny, uniformly spaced teeth of finely drawn iron wire. The cold metal caught the pale autumn sun, releasing a faint, clean scent of protective linseed oil into the crisp morning air. The introduction of these iron-toothed cards brought an immediate, miraculous lightness to the labour of the hearthside circles. Sitting near the community workshop fire, the master weavers demonstrated the proper technique to the gathered apprentices. With a smooth, opposing sliding motion, the 2 wooden paddles were drawn across each other, the fine iron teeth combing through the raw wool with a soft, clean shh sound that filled the room. The iron did not tear or snag the fleece. Instead, it effortlessly separated the tangled locks, aligning the individual fibres into perfectly uniform, cloud-like bats of wool in a fraction of the previous time. The sensory atmosphere of the workshops deepened with this technological leap. The rustic smell of burning oak and the rich lanolin of the raw fleece now blended with the clean, structured aroma of the polished beechwood handles and the faint metallic tang of the oiled iron. Because the fibres could now be prepared with such effortless consistency, the subsequent spinning process became even smoother. The thread drawn from the distaffs achieved a flawless, unbroken diameter, which in turn promised an even tighter, more wind-resistant weave when the yarn finally reached the tall, upright looms. As the dusk descended, painting the vast eastern sky in deep shades of violet and amber, the village workshops remained alive with this new, efficient rhythm. The continuous musical sigh of the iron teeth preparing the wool echoed softly off the timber walls, a steady pulse of human progress mastering the raw materials of the earth. The people looked at the mounds of light, airy wool bats filling the willow baskets, and felt a profound sense of security. The young kingdom, through the thoughtful maternal foresight of its queen, had given them the tools to bind their society together even faster, forging an ironclad tradition of warmth and dignity that no winter could ever erode. With the abundance of perfectly uniform cloud-like wool bats provided by the new iron-toothed cards, the master weavers at Veszprém found themselves possessing a material of unprecedented consistency. No longer forced to compensate for lumps or weak points in the yarn, They began exploring advanced technical frontiers under the quiet encouragement of Queen Gisela. Gathering around the largest oak frame in the central atelier, the elders set out to experiment with a complex triple weave technique, a sophisticated structural geometry designed to produce a textile completely impenetrable to the fiercest winter gales. The setup of the loom for this new technique was an exercise in absolute mathematical discipline. Instead of the standard dual layer of warp threads, the weavers meticulously threaded 3 independent parallel sets of yarn onto the deep beam, utilizing an intricate system of multiple heddle rods. They chose 3 distinct organic tones, a deep madder red for the inner layer, a structural slate grey for the hidden core, and a rich, oily ochre for the weather-facing exterior. The air in the room was thick with a quiet, meditative intensity, sweet with the scent of fresh wood shavings and the grounding rich musk of the newly carded fleece. The execution of the triple weave required a slow, synchronized choreography between 2 master artisans standing on either side of the towering frame. As the shuttles were thrown, the threads did not merely cross at right angles, they locked together internally, pocketing tiny, microscopic cells of air between the 3 distinct layers of cloth. The sound of the labor changed from the usual sharp click of the loom to a deep, resonant thump as the heavy ivory comb packed the dense layers tight. It was a powerful, comforting cadence that filled the stone room with a profound sense of structural security. When the first trial length of the new fabric was cut from the frame, its qualities astonished the entire court. The cloth possessed a magnificent sculptural weight, yet remained remarkably pliant and smooth to the touch. To test its resilience, the carpenter carried a piece out to the high, wind-swept ramparts where the northern gale was howling fiercely off the peaks. Holding the dense triple weave against the blast, not a single breath of cold air could pierce the structure. The outer ochre layer repelled the damp frost, the grey core trapped the moving air, and the inner red layer remained wonderfully warm and soothing against the skin. This impenetrable cloth represented a monumental leap forward for the state's security. It was instantly designated for the cloaks of the border watchmen and the deep winter blankets of the outermost settlements, ensuring that those who guarded the realm's frontiers were wrapped in an absolute shield of insulation. Standing in the golden afternoon light of the workshop, looking down at the dense, multi-layered masterpiece, Queen Gisela felt a deep systemic peace. Through the perfect harmony of iron tools and human patience, her people had woven a defensive barrier that was softer than stone, warmer than iron, and entirely unbroken. In the deep, silent hours of a late November night, the long-awaited midwinter blizzard finally arrived over the Pannonian plains. It did not come with a chaotic fury, but rather as a vast, drifting quietness that systematically erased the dark contours of the landscape under a heavy mantle of pristine white. Outside the high timber walls of the valley settlements, millions of thick crystalline snowflakes fell straight through the windless air, settling softly upon the thatched roofs, the frozen wells, and the empty flax fields. The vast world outside became an immense, freezing void, yet the absolute stillness of the snowfall only highlighted the profound sense of security established within the village perimeters. Inside the community workshops, the atmosphere was a sanctuary of light, warmth, and unhurried industry. The great stone hearths blazed with massive logs of seasoned oak and split ash, casting a deep, flickering amber glow that danced across the sturdy wooden rafters. The air was thick with a comforting, multi-layered sensory signature, the sweet, clean perfume of dried mint bundles warming near the chimney, the rich musk of raw wool lanolin, and the crisp, starchy freshness of linen threads resting in the willow baskets. There was no fear of the rising drifts outside. The storehouses were already packed to the ceilings with dense blankets, insulated tunics, and the newly perfected triple weave cloaks. A small circle of weavers and spinners remained near the fire, their movements slow, deliberate, and entirely free of haste. They sat on low beechwood benches, their faces illuminated by the soft golden light of the flames as they continued their craft into the night. The continuous soothing purr of the bone spindle whorls dancing across the clay floorboards blended beautifully with the soft musical click of a small upright loom positioned near the hearth. It was a hypnotic domestic symphony that seemed to push the freezing darkness completely out of the room, replacing it with a structured, civilized peace. Through the small, thick glass panes of the high windows, the artisans could see the white wilderness deepening against the stone sills, but the sight brought only a quiet sense of triumph. The children lay asleep on deep straw beds nearby, wrapped like small cocoons in the vibrant madder-red herringbone blankets, their breathing slow and perfectly regular. The tight, uniform weave of the textiles acted as an absolute living barrier against the elements, trapping the natural warmth of the body and turning the bitterest night of the year into a period of deep, restorative rest. As the midnight watchman made his slow rounds through the village, his boots making a soft, muffled crunch in the fresh snow, he looked through the workshop door and exchanged a silent, knowing nod with the elders by the fire. The young kingdom had successfully mastered its environment, not through walls of iron or weapons of war, but through the patient, maternal foresight of its queen and the enduring logic of the thread. Inside the warm candlelit sanctuary, surrounded by the physical fruits of their shared dedication, the people felt completely secure, knowing that their community was woven so tightly into its own dignity that no winter storm could ever hope to unravel its core. When the morning sun finally broke through the dense winter clouds, it cast a brilliant, blinding light across a world completely transformed by the snow. The valley settlements lay cradled within deep, pristine drifts that rose as high as the windowsills, turning the rustic timber buildings into soft white mounds. The air was bitingly cold, so clear and still that the loudest sound was the distant faint crack of frozen branches in the forest. Yet, as the heavy wooden doors of the cottages swung open, the bleak, defensive isolation that had once frozen the community in place was nowhere to be found. The villagers stepped out into the deep powder, not with hesitant shivering, but with a confident, joyful energy that brought the white landscape to life. They emerged wrapped in the magnificent fruits of their autumn labours, vibrant madder-red cloaks, thick ochre shawls, and the newly perfected triple-weave tunics that completely repelled the freezing air. The contrast was breathtaking. Against the vast uniform white of the snow, the deep organic colours of Queen Gisela's textiles glowed with a rich jewel-like brilliance, turning the village paths into a moving tapestry of warmth and human craftsmanship. Children plunged into the drifts with bright, ringing laughter, their small bodies completely insulated within their dense wool coverings, their hands protected by thick mittens that kept the frost from chapping their skin. Their breath rose into the crisp air in steady, pale plumes of mist, but beneath the heavy fabric their bodies remained as warm as if they were still tucked beside the hearth fire. Young mothers and village elders walked down to the cleared pathways to greet one another, their faces relaxed and smiling, completely free of the historic dread that had once made the first heavy snowfall a harbinger of sickness and despair. Men began clearing the deep drifts from the workshop entrances with steady, unhurried movements, their heavy cloaks catching the morning light as they worked. The snow was deep, but it was no longer an impenetrable wall separating them from survival. It had become merely a seasonal backdrop to a highly organized, secure way of life. The storehouses were full, the hearths were well stocked with seasoned oak logs, and every member of the community, from the youngest infant to the most fragile elder, was nestled safely within a flawless armor of insulation. As the noon sun reached its highest point, reflecting millions of tiny diamond-like sparkles across the snowy plains, the village elders stood together near the frozen well, looking out over the lively, colourful scene. They felt a profound, systemic sense of peace and gratitude settling over their hearts. Through the patient, structured vision of their queen and the steady discipline of their own hands, they had done more than just survive a storm. They had permanently transformed the nature of winter itself, weaving an enduring mantle of security, dignity, and joy that would guard their children for generations to come. As the winter progressed, settling into a predictable cycle of crisp, sunny days and silent starlit nights, the profound impact of the textile industry reached its highest, most enduring realization. The art of the loom had accomplished something that decades of political decrees and military garrisons could never quite secure. It had woven the wildly disparate, often conflicting clans of the young kingdom into a single, cohesive and deeply peaceful national identity. Before Queen Gisela established her great network of workshops, the realm had been a fragile mosaic of separate tribes, ancient nomadic clans from the eastern steppes, settled Slavic farmers in the river valleys, and newly arrived Western artisans, each speaking different dialects and viewing one another with an ingrained defensive suspicion. But within the quiet limestone walls of the weaving halls, those ancient boundaries had quietly dissolved. Standing side by side before the towering oak frames, women from entirely different backgrounds had spent months communicating through the universal, silent language of human craftsmanship. The physical evidence of this great unification was now visible in every corner of the land. Whether in a remote border outpost along the northern hills or in a thriving market town by the Danube, the people walked wrapped in the exact same patterns, the identical, mathematically precise herringbone twills, the rich madder red borders, and the dense weather-facing ochre cloaks. This shared aesthetic created an instant, powerful sense of mutual recognition. When travellers met on the snowy mountain passes, the sight of the familiar royal textiles did not trigger defensive anxiety or the reaching for weapons. Instead, it brought a relaxed, systemic sense of security and kinship. They recognized one another not as strangers from rival clans, but as equal citizens of a structured, civilized society. This cultural integration was deeply grounded in the shared knowledge that had been systematically distributed across the realm. The plumwood shuttles, the bone spindle walls, and the iron-toothed wool cards were identical in every village, beating to the same slow, industrious cadence. The regional variations that did emerge were no longer causes for division, but gifts of shared enrichment. Eastern weavers introduced subtle geometric border motifs inspired by their ancestral tapestries, while Western artisans contributed refined techniques for processing the warp threads, all of it harmonized under the Queen's serene vision. As the amber twilight of a peaceful winter afternoon blanketed the citadel of Vesprem, the steady rhythmic chorus of the looms continued to echo off the stone flagstones. The young kingdom was no longer a collection of vulnerable, isolated fragments struggling against the wilderness and each other. Through the patient, maternal foresight of their queen and the eternal logic of the thread, the people had found their collective strength. They had woven a flawless armor of national unity, a deep, multi-layered tapestry of shared dignity, warmth, and peace that was strong enough to withstand any storm from without, and entirely unbroken from within. With the arrival of May, the fierce winter snows surrendered completely to a spectacular, vibrant spring that swept across the Pannonian Basin. The limestone meadows surrounding the citadel of Vesprem erupted into an endless carpet of wild chamomile and crimson poppies, their sweet herbal fragrance lifting on the warm southern breezes. To celebrate this season of renewal and the profound peace that had settled over the realm, Queen Gisela declared a legendary gathering, a grand festival where weavers, spinners, and dyers from every remote corner of the kingdom would journey to the capital to display their finest regional masterpieces before the royal court. For days, the main highway leading up to the fortress gates was a moving kaleidoscope of colour and joyful industry. Long caravans of high-wheeled wooden wagons, decorated with fresh willow branches and blossoming orchards, rolled slowly up the stone ramps. The air was filled with a festive, buoyant energy, rich with the aromas of fresh roasting meats, sweet honey cakes, and the clean, distinct scent of pristine textiles that had been preserved all winter in deep cedar chests. Artisans from the northern hills brought delicate linens bleached white as alpine snow, while delegations from the eastern steppes presented heavy, luxurious blankets adorned with intricate geometric sunbursts that mirrored their nomadic heritage. The great reception hall of the palace was transformed into a magnificent gallery of national craftsmanship. Hundreds of long timber tables were arranged beneath the high limestone arches, draped in an astonishing variety of textures, weights, and dyes. The bright spring sun poured through the open windows, illuminating the vast display with an unshadowed clarity that revealed the absolute precision of every single stitch and thread crossing. There was no spirit of jealous rivalry in the room. Instead, the artisans moved between the tables in quiet circles, touching the fabrics with their smooth lanolin-softened fingers, exchanging technical insights in low, deeply respectful tones. King Stephen and Queen Gisela walked together down the centre of the hall, flanked by their highest councillors and foreign emissaries, who looked upon the scene with open astonishment. As the king reached out to feel the dense, indestructible weave of a southern watchman's cloak, his face softened into a look of profound satisfaction. He saw before him the absolute validation of his queen's strategic vision. This hall did not just display beautiful cloth, it showcased the highly organized, self-sufficient soul of a unified empire that had learned to conquer the harsh realities of the earth through the quiet discipline of the loom. As the afternoon maturely dissolved into a soft golden twilight, casting long amber beams across the shimmering tapestries and satisfied faces of the artisans, the queen raised a simple silver goblet to toast her people. A deep emotional silence fell over the massive room. They had survived the bitter frosts. They had educated one another across ancient tribal divides, and they had forged a collective identity grounded in shared dignity and patience. Standing together in the heart of the capital, surrounded by the breathtaking fruits of their shared dedication, the people realized that they were no longer just a collection of separate villages. They were a single magnificent tapestry, woven so tightly by the hands of peace that its beauty would endure for centuries to come. As the years matured into a golden age of unshakable stability, the memory of those first desperate winters faded into the peaceful folklore of a proud and unified nation. The great network of textile workshops, founded in a time of urgent necessity beneath the limestone towers of Veszprém, remained the beating heart of the kingdom's identity. Queen Gisela's serene vision had permanently taken root in the soil, transforming the young realm from a vulnerable frontier into a sophisticated sanctuary of culture, order, and enduring human dignity. The legacy of the loom was etched into the very cadence of daily life. In every valley and across every hillside, the continuous musical sigh of the heddles shifting and the deep, grounding thud of the wooden combs packing the threads tight became the timeless soundtrack of the realm. The knowledge was now an ancestral inheritance. Young mothers who had once arrived at the palace gates as anxious apprentices now sat as revered elders by the village hearths, their smooth, lanolin-softened fingers guiding a new generation of children through the sacred geometry of the herringbone twill. Under the long, peaceful reign of King Stephen and his queen, the kingdom flourished, wrapped in a physical and spiritual armour that no external storm could ever pierce. The grand coronation mantle, stitched during those quiet midnight hours under the steady glow of beeswax candles, stood preserved in the cathedral treasury, a shimmering masterpiece of deep indigo, gold and silk that remained a historic shield of majesty for centuries to come. It was a physical testament to a time when a society learned to conquer the wild, chaotic elements of its environment, not through weapons of war, but through the patient, civilized discipline of the thread. As the quiet evening twilight drapes the ancient stone walls of Veszprém in shades of soft amber and deep velvet blue, a profound systemic peace settles over the land. The great wheel of the seasons continues to turn, bringing its thaws, its harvests, and its frosts, but the people look toward the horizon with a calm and unshakable confidence. They are no longer isolated or afraid. They are bound together in an eternal circle of warmth, craftsmanship, and mutual respect. Guided by the memory of their gentle queen, the nation stands whole, secure, and serene, forever woven into a singular, magnificent tapestry of lasting peace and absolute dignity. If you have found a sanctuary of deep comfort and quiet reflection within this long journey through the woven tapestries of our shared past, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this narrative. Your support helps open this peaceful harbour of historical reflection to others seeking a restful space before sleep. Thank you for listening, and may your rest be deep, warm, and entirely unbroken. The channel History Under Moonlight is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales, gently curated and narrated based on themes such as ancient mysteries, forgotten chronicles, and the calm, reflective moments of our shared past through time.